He said it into a microphone, in front of 400 people, his pregnant wife standing 20 feet away. Marco Bellondi leaned toward the podium, champagne already loosening his tongue, and said, "The only mistake bigger than my first marriage was not throwing away the toys sooner." Then he laughed. And Bianca Russo, standing at his right shoulder in a dress that cost more than most people's rent, laughed with him. Elena heard every word. 7 months pregnant, feet swollen inside heels she'd worn because he said he liked them. Carrying a watch in her purse that she'd spent 4 months restoring, his father's watch, as an anniversary gift for a man who just called her disposable in front of cameras. She didn't cry. She reached into her glass, pulled out her wedding ring, and dropped it into his champagne. Then she walked out. And none of them, not Marco, not Bianca, not a single person in that gilded ballroom, had any idea what they had just set in motion. So, if that moment hit you somewhere deep, stay with me. This story is going to take you somewhere you didn't expect. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next, and hit that like button right now. Drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning, because nothing about this night happened by accident. Elena Bellondi had not wanted to come. That was the truth she kept turning over in her mind during the 40-minute ride from their Upper East Side apartment to the Meridian Hotel. The truth she kept swallowing back down every time it rose in her throat like bile. She had not wanted to put on the navy dress. She had not wanted to wrestle her swollen feet into the heels Marco had set out on the bedroom chair the morning before, the ones he'd bought her in Milan 2 years ago, back when he still noticed what she wore. She had not wanted to go, but she had gone anyway, because that was what Elena did. That was what she had always done. She smoothed things over. She showed up. She made it look fine when it wasn't fine, and she smiled at the right people, and she kept the machine running even when her hands were shaking underneath the tablecloth. 7 months along, and she was still doing it. The driver, Thomas Greco, who had worked for the Bellondi family for 11 years and who Elena trusted more than almost anyone else in her life, had glanced at her in the rearview mirror twice before she told him to stop. "I'm fine, Thomas." "Mrs. Bellondi, I said I'm fine." He hadn't pushed. He never pushed. But she'd seen the way his jaw tightened, the small, careful way he'd returned his eyes to the road, and she'd known he didn't believe her any more than she believed herself. The watch was in her purse. That was the thing she kept coming back to. The thing that made the whole night feel different, feel weighted. The silver pocket watch with the cracked crystal and the engraving on the back that read, "For the man who built something real." Antonio Bellondi had carried it for 32 years. He'd been buried with the replica because the real one had disappeared somewhere in the chaos of the estate settlement, and Marco had never mentioned it, never asked about it, never seemed to notice it was gone. Elena had found it in a storage unit in New Jersey. She'd recognized it from an old photograph. She'd tracked down a horologist in Brooklyn who'd spent 6 weeks cleaning and calibrating the movement, replacing the crystal, restoring the leather fob. She had paid for it herself from the account Marco didn't know about, the one she'd kept since the early days of the company, when she'd been the one managing payroll and she'd quietly set aside a small percentage each month, not because she was hiding anything, but because something in her gut had always told her to keep a door open. She had planned to give it to him tonight. She had thought, and this was the part that made her feel foolish now, sitting in the back seat watching the hotel entrance materialize through the rain-streaked window. She had thought it might remind him of his father, of who Antonio Bellondi had been before the money came, of the man Marco used to be, or the man she'd believed he was, which might not have been the same thing. She had thought a watch might fix something. That was how desperate she'd become. The Meridian's grand ballroom had been transformed for the occasion in that particular way that only very expensive parties manage, where the excess is so total it somehow circles back around to looking effortless. 10 years. A decade of Bellondi maritime, and Marco had spared nothing to market. 12-foot floral installations. A string quartet in the East Corner playing pieces Elena recognized from the early dinner parties she used to host in their first apartment, back when they'd had a folding table and mismatched wine glasses, and Marco used to call her his secret weapon. 400 guests. Politicians, investors, board members, the kind of Manhattan money that moved in its own gravitational field and pulled everything else into orbit around it. Elena moved through it carefully, one hand resting against the underside of her stomach in that unconscious gesture she'd developed over the past few weeks, the one that was half protective and half steadying. She wasn't sure which. She found Carla Messi near the bar. Carla was married to one of Marco's early investors and had the particular gift of knowing everything about everyone without appearing to pay attention to anything. She kissed Elena's cheek and said, "You look exhausted, sweetheart," which was Carla's way of being kind. "I'm fine." "You keep saying that." Carla handed her a glass of sparkling water without being asked. "Where's Marco?" Elena scanned the room. It took her a moment. The crowd was thick, the lighting was warm and deliberately flattering. And then she found him near the main stage, laughing with a group of men in suits. That particular laugh he had when he was performing confidence rather than feeling it. His shoulders were back. His tie was perfect. He looked like the cover of something. And then Elena saw who was standing at his shoulder. Bianca Russo. Not across the room. Not at a table. At his shoulder. Close enough that when Marco turned to say something, his mouth was inches from her ear. Close enough that Bianca's hand rested on the back of his jacket for just a moment, just a half second, before she let it drop. Elena's stomach did something complicated. She had known about Bianca the way you know about a bruise you've been pressing on so long it doesn't hurt the same way anymore. Bianca Russo, executive advisor, brought on 14 months ago by the board when Belandi Maritime began its push into European contracts. "Brilliant," Marco had said. "Strategic. Exactly what we need right now." Elena had sat across the dinner table from that word, strategic, and understood it meant she wasn't supposed to ask follow-up questions. She'd ask them anyway. Marco had been patient at first, then irritated. Then he'd stopped coming home for dinner at all, and the questions had nowhere to go, and Elena had learned to hold them inside herself where they collected like water in a sealed room. She watched Bianca laugh at something Marco said. She watched him touch the small of Bianca's back. For 3 full seconds, Elena stood completely still. Then Carla put a hand on her arm and said, very quietly, "Elena, don't." She said it gently. She didn't look away from the stage. "Please don't say anything kind right now. I can't afford it." Carla's hand stayed on her arm. Steady. That was enough. Elena had not planned to approach him. She had planned, in the dim, provisional way she'd been planning things for months now, always contingent on what Marco might or might not do, to get through the evening, to find a table, to be visible without being confrontational, to demonstrate by her presence that whatever story was being written tonight, she was still in it. She had not planned to give him the watch anymore either. That plan had quietly dissolved somewhere between the bar and the sight of Bianca's hand on his jacket. What she had not planned for was the announcement. It started the way these things always started. The clink of a knife against crystal, the subtle migration of the room toward the stage, the gathering of attention that Marco had always been extraordinarily good at engineering. He took the microphone with that easy, practiced confidence that had charmed a lot of people over a lot of years, including Elena herself, once. He spoke about the company, about growth, about vision. He thanked the board, the investors, the management team. He was good at this. Elena had always given him that. Whatever else he'd become, Marco Belandi could hold a room. And then he shifted. She saw it before she heard it, a slight change in his posture, a small private smile directed somewhere off to his left, directed at Bianca. 10 years ago, Marco said, I made a few decisions that shaped this company. Some of them were good, some of them... He paused, and the room gave him an appreciative murmur, the sound of an audience leaning in. Some of them were the kind of mistakes you laugh about later, when you've grown past them. Elena went still. The room felt different. She couldn't have explained it. Some animal part of her understood what was coming before her conscious mind did, and her hand pressed harder against the underside of her stomach. The thing about building something real, Marco continued, his voice easy, warm, carrying that particular register of man-among-men camaraderie that he deployed at events like this, is that you figure out pretty fast what's worth keeping and what's, well. He lifted his glass. Another pause. Another small smile toward Bianca. What's just a cheap toy you forgot to throw away? The laughter started in clusters. It took Elena approximately 4 seconds to understand that it was directed at her. Not a dramatic silence. Not the room turning to stare. Something worse. The laughter of people who understood the joke and found it acceptable. The quiet scandal of the powerful protecting their own. The murmur of amusement rippling through 400 people who had all, at some point, sat at Elena Belandi's dinner table and eaten her food. She looked at Marco. He looked back at her. And she watched him realize, in real time, like watching someone remember they've left a door open, that she was close enough to have heard every word. That she had, in fact, heard every word. He didn't apologize. He didn't falter. He raised his glass slightly, as if in acknowledgement, and turned back to the room. Elena reached into her glass. The ring was wet when she pulled it out. A simple platinum band, the original one, not the diamond-encrusted version he'd replaced it with on their 5th anniversary because he'd said she deserved something better. She'd kept the original. She didn't know why. Sentiment, maybe. The stubborn preservation of evidence of something real. She dropped it into his champagne glass. She didn't announce it. She didn't make a speech. She turned around and walked toward the exit at the exact pace she would use to walk to the bathroom, measured, even, like she was going somewhere ordinary. The murmur that followed her toward the door was something she filed away in the part of herself she'd deal with later. Right now, she needed air, Sab. Thomas was waiting at the curb. He always waited at the curb. No matter what she'd told him about finding parking, he didn't trust valets, he said, but she'd always suspected it was actually that he didn't trust being too far away when he was needed. He took one look at her face and opened the door without a word. She got in. She sat for 30 seconds, maybe 40, while he didn't say anything and she didn't say anything, and the hotel entrance glowed behind them in the wet dark. And somewhere up on the 9th floor, 400 people were probably still talking about what they'd just seen. Thomas? Yes, ma'am. Take me home. He pulled out into traffic. She watched the hotel disappear in the side mirror. Her phone buzzed. She expected Marco. She expected some version of the conversation they'd had before. The quiet, controlled apology that wasn't really an apology. The redirect toward her own behavior. The explanation that would somehow end with her feeling like she had misunderstood. She braced for it the way you brace for something you've been hit with before. The muscle memory of it. The number was unknown. The message was 5 words. Don't go home. They're waiting. Elena stared at the screen. Thomas. Her voice came out wrong. She heard it, the thinness of it, the crack running through the middle. Has anyone been watching the apartment? Recently? The pause was too long. Thomas. There was a car, he said carefully. Black SUV, parked across from the building 3 times this week. I noted the plates. Another pause. I didn't want to worry you. Did you run them? Registered to a shell company. I had my nephew look into it. He couldn't get much further. Elena looked at the message again. Don't go home. They're waiting. She didn't know this number. She didn't know who had sent it. She didn't know whether it was a threat or a warning or something else entirely. Some third category she didn't have a name for yet. What she knew was that her son was moving. She could feel him shifting against her ribs, that strange internal motion that had become the most real thing in her life over the past several months, more real than anything happening in ballrooms or boardrooms. Don't take me home, she said. Thomas nodded once, like he'd been waiting for her to say it. He changed lanes. Elena called Marco 3 times. The first time it rang through to voicemail. His voicemail greeting was professional. His work voice, careful, clipped. She hung up without leaving a message. The second time, the same. The third time someone answered. Not Marco. Bianca. There was a beat of silence on both ends. The particular silence of 2 people who have been circling each other for over a year and have now accidentally ended up on the same phone line. Elena heard music in the background, the same string quartet from the ballroom. She heard the sound of Marco laughing at something nearby. Elena? Bianca's voice was composed. Of course it was. Everything about Bianca Russo was composed. Put Marco on. He's in the middle of something important. If you'd like to leave a... Put Marco on. Another pause, longer this time. He'll call you back. The line went dead. Elena sat with her phone in her lap and looked at the back of Thomas's head and thought about what her life had become, measured in voicemails, in closed doors, in the careful management of what she was allowed to ask for. She had been a founding partner of the company that was currently celebrating its 10th anniversary without her. She had negotiated the first 3 international contracts. She had built the compliance framework that kept them out of federal trouble in 2019. She had done all of that, and somehow, gradually, the way water carves stone, so slowly you don't see it happening, she had been reduced to leaving messages. Something shifted inside her, not in her chest, lower. A tightening, then another. She knew what it was before she let herself think it. Thomas, she kept her voice even. I need you to go to the hospital. He was already moving to the right lane. Yes, ma'am. Don't speed. I don't want to. She stopped, breathed. Just drive normally, but quickly. I know, he said. I know. The contractions were irregular, but real. The obstetrician on call, a woman named Dr. Farrow, who had the particular bedside manner of someone who had handled 10,000 moments of fear, and who understood that calm, actual calm, not performed calm, was the most useful thing she could offer, examined Elena and said, with the careful precision of someone choosing words for a specific purpose, we need to stop this. How far? 31 weeks. We have time, but we need to get medication in you, and we need you to stop moving and stop whatever was happening before you came in here. I don't have much control over what was happening. I understand that. Dr. Farrow put a hand on Elena's arm. The same gesture Carla had used, but different. Clinical and warm at the same time, that particular combination. But right now your body is making a decision your baby isn't ready for, so I need you to try. Elena closed her eyes. She tried. Thomas sat in the waiting room with his coat folded across his knees and his phone face down on the seat beside him. At some point, he couldn't have said how much later, he went out to the car to get the light jacket Elena had left on the back seat, the one she'd likely want when the hospital air conditioning started to bother her. He opened the back door. There was something under the windshield wiper. He noticed it on the way back around to lock up. A white envelope, tucked carefully under the rubber, not from wind. Someone had placed it there deliberately. He stood in the hospital parking garage for a moment, alone, listening to the hum of ventilation and the distant sound of traffic. Then he opened it. Inside was a photograph. Elena. Recent. Taken in the last few weeks. From the distance and angle, he could tell it was taken from across the street. She was wearing the navy dress from tonight, which meant it had been taken today. In the daylight, before the party. Around her wrist was the silver bracelet she always wore. The one with the small bird charm, worn smooth with age. She'd had it since Elena had known her. Thomas had never seen her without it. She'd said once it was the only thing she had from before her adoption. She didn't talk about it more than that. On the back of the photograph, in ink that hadn't fully dried, we found Alessia Marino. Thomas read it twice. Then he read it a third time. He stood in the parking garage with the photograph in his hand and the ventilation humming around him in traffic somewhere beyond the concrete. And he thought about Elena lying in a hospital bed, 31 weeks pregnant, fighting to keep her son inside her long enough for the world to be safe for him. And he thought about the black SUV parked outside her building 3 times that week. And he thought about Alessia Marino, a name he hadn't heard in 30 years, but which anyone in the tri-state area above a certain age remembered. The kidnapping that had never been solved. The Sicilian shipping family. The child who was 4 years old and then simply gone. His hand was not entirely steady when he put the photograph in his jacket pocket. He went back inside. He sat down in the waiting room. He put his phone face down on the seat beside him, and he did not touch it for a very long time, because he needed to think, and because what he was thinking was so large and so strange and so potentially dangerous that he needed to be certain before he moved a single inch in any direction. Well, Elena, inside the room, did not sleep. The medication worked. The contractions slowed, then stopped. The particular relief of a crisis deferred that felt nothing like safety and everything like borrowed time. Dr. Farrow said the words she needed to say and left a nurse in place and dimmed the lights, and the room became a very specific kind of quiet that hospitals have. Not peaceful, not restful, but suspended. The quality of waiting. Elena lay in the dark and thought about the message on her phone. Don't go home. They're waiting. She thought about the champagne ring, about Bianca answering Marco's phone, about the watch still in her purse somewhere. She'd been clutching the purse in the car, and she'd set it down somewhere, and now she wasn't sure where it was, and that bothered her more than it should have, the not knowing where the watch was. She thought about her mother. Not Marco's mother.
His mother had died 4 years ago, a small, precise woman who had always looked at Elena with an expression she could never quite decode. Her own mother. Diane Reeves, who taught third grade in Westchester and made excellent pie and had the kind of stubborn, practical love that does not announce itself, who had told Elena when she was 12 years old, sitting in a kitchen that smelled like coffee and dish soap and ordinary life, that Elena had been chosen, that the paperwork had been the most important document Diane had ever signed. That love, the real kind, the kind that lasted, was a choice you made every day. Elena had believed her. She had believed it about her parents. She had believed it about Marco once. The believing had taken a long time to become not believing, because she was the kind of person who kept looking for evidence on the other side, who kept trying to verify before concluding, who needed to be certain. She was certain now. She lay in the hospital room with her son's heartbeat measured on a screen beside her, and she thought, I was not thrown away. I walked away. There is a difference, and I'm going to need that difference to be true. Her phone was on the bedside table. She hadn't touched it since the car. At some point after 2 a.m, it lit up. Marco. She watched it ring. She watched it stop. She watched the notification appear. 1 missed call. Then nothing. She put the phone face down. Outside the window, the city did what the city always did. It kept going, indifferent and enormous, lit up against the dark. Somewhere in that city was a ballroom where 400 people were finishing their champagne. Somewhere was an apartment with a black SUV parked across the street. Somewhere was a woman named Bianca Russo who had answered her husband's phone, and a watch and a purse that she needed to find, and a message from an unknown number that she still didn't understand. And somewhere, though Elena did not know this yet, somewhere there was a man sitting in a hotel room on the other side of the Atlantic who had just received a photograph and a request, and who was, for the first time in nearly 30 years, allowing himself to be afraid of something other than failure. His name was Salvatore Marino, and the thing he was afraid of was hope. The nurse came back at 6 a.m. to check vitals. She was young, 24, maybe 25, and she had the efficient gentleness of someone new enough to still mean it. Your husband is in the waiting room, she said, while she was noting numbers on the tablet. Carefully neutral. The tone of someone trained not to express opinions. Elena looked at the ceiling. Is he? He's been there about an hour. He asked if he could come in. I told him it was up to you. It's not him I want to see. The nurse nodded, entered something, moved toward the door. Could you ask Thomas Greco to come in? He's the older man. Gray jacket, probably sitting by himself. Of course. She left. Elena turned her head toward the window. The city was changing color. That particular early morning gray going soft at the edges with the beginning of light, the world recovering from itself. Thomas came in quietly, the way he did everything. He sat in the chair beside the bed. He put the photograph on the blanket, face down. I found something, he said. Show me. He turned it over. Elena looked at it for a long time. The photograph. Herself, in the navy dress. From across the street she recognized as being 3 blocks from the Meridian, taken before she'd gone inside, before the speech, before any of it. She looked at the back. She read it twice, the way Thomas had. We found Alessia Marino. Something moved through her. Not an emotion she had a precise name for, more like a pressure change, the feeling before weather. The bracelet on her wrist felt suddenly heavy. The bird charm, smooth with age, the metal warm from her skin. Thomas. Her voice was level. She was proud of that, in a distant way. When I was placed with my parents, did anyone ever tell you? Did you ever hear anything about, I've known you for 11 years, he said, careful, precise. I've seen your wrist every day. The bracelet. Yes. She turned the photograph over again, looked at her own wrist in the image. My parents told me it was in the bag with me, she said, when they got me. Whoever... She stopped, breathed. I was 4. I don't remember anything before the house in Westchester. She paused. That's not true. I remember a garden. I remember someone's hands. But I don't... It's not enough to mean anything. It might mean something now, Thomas said. He sat with his hands in his lap, not pressing, not pushing. Outside, Marco was in the waiting room. Inside, Elena was holding a photograph of herself and thinking about a name she had never heard applied to her before.
Alessia Marino. She looked at Thomas. "Get me a lawyer," she said, "not one of Marco's. I already have someone in mind. And find out about the DNA." She looked at the photograph one more time, then set it face down on the blanket. "Whatever this is, whatever they're claiming, I need to know if it's true. I need to know before anyone else does." Thomas nodded. He stood. At the door, he paused. "Your son's heart rate has been strong all night," he said. "I asked the nurse." He looked back at her. "Both of you are going to be all right." She didn't answer that, but she put her hand over her stomach, feeling the small movement there. Her son, alive and insisting on it, 31 weeks and already stubborn as anything. And she thought, yes, both of us are going to be all right. She thought it hard enough that she almost believed it. The door closed. The city outside went on turning from gray to pale gold. In the waiting room down the hall, Marco Bellondi sat with his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands, and the champagne ring was somewhere at the bottom of a crystal glass in a ballroom that was already being cleaned, and everything, so every single thing he thought he owned, was about to be taken apart. He just didn't know it yet. Marco had been sitting in the same chair for 2 hours and 40 minutes when Thomas walked past him without stopping. That was the thing that finally cracked something open in his chest. Not Elena dropping the ring, not the silence of the room after he'd said what he'd said, not even Bianca's hand on his arm in the car afterward. Steady and proprietary in a way that had felt like comfort at the time. It was Thomas Greco walking past him in a hospital hallway at 7 in the morning with his jaw set and his eyes fixed straight ahead, deliberately not looking down, the specific studied non-acknowledgement of a man who has made a decision about you and found you insufficient. Marco had known Thomas for 11 years. Thomas had driven him to 3 airport terminals, 2 hospital emergency rooms, 1 police precinct, and 1 meeting that had saved the company from a hostile acquisition in 2021. He had never once walked past Marco Bellondi without at least a nod. Marco stood up. "Thomas." Thomas kept walking. "Thomas, I need to talk to her." Thomas stopped. He turned around slowly, the way men his age turn. The whole body, deliberate, nothing wasted. He looked at Marco for a long moment. His expression was the particular blankness of someone who has too many things to say and has chosen to say none of them. "She doesn't want to see you," he said. She was clear. "I need to explain, Mr. Bellondi." Thomas's voice was even, not angry, something worse than angry, final. "The doctor said she needs rest and no stress. You showing up in there would be both." He held Marco's gaze for another beat. "I'll tell her you came." He turned and walked toward the elevators. Marco stood in the hallway with his hands at his sides and watched him go. And the thing he felt was not what he expected. He'd expected defensiveness, the automatic reflex of someone caught doing something they'd rationalized into being acceptable. He'd prepared for an argument, the kind he was good at, controlled, structured, the kind where he got to define the terms. What he felt instead was something closer to vertigo. The hallway smelled like antiseptic and floor cleaner, and the particular institutional staleness of places designed for crisis. And somewhere down that hall, his wife was in a bed with monitors on her and their son's heartbeat on a screen, and he had not known about any of it until Bianca had been looking at her phone and said, very calmly, "Elena's at the hospital," and he had not moved immediately. He had sat there another 20 minutes finishing a conversation about contract logistics, and that specific 20 minutes was going to be something he carried for a long time. He took out his phone. He called Bianca. She answered on the second ring. "How is she?" "They won't let me see her." A pause. "Then come back. There's nothing you can do there, Marco. The morning briefing with the Stavros people is at 9, and after last night we need to—" "I'm not leaving the hospital, Bianca." Another pause. Longer. The quality of silence that contains recalibration. "Okay," she said, finally. Her voice was still level. It was always level. He had found that quality attractive for over a year, and standing in this hallway right now, he found it profoundly alienating. "Call me when you know something." She hung up. Marco sat back down in the chair and put his phone face down on his knee and looked at the wall across from him, which was painted the particular shade of institutional beige that communicates, whether intentionally or not, that you are somewhere things go wrong. 3 floors up, in the office of the hospital's patient advocacy coordinator, Thomas Greco sat across from a woman named Sandra Park, who had a law degree, she no longer used in courtrooms, and a facility for rapid document review that she had never stopped using anywhere. He had called her from the parking garage at 5 in the morning. She had arrived at 6:45 with a leather folio and a coffee she hadn't touched. He put the photograph on the desk between them. Sandra looked at it without touching it. "You found this on the windshield. Under the wiper. Someone placed it deliberately." She looked at the back, read it, set the photograph down. "How certain are you?" "About what specifically?" "That Elena Belandi might be who this claims." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "The bracelet she wears. She's had it her whole life. The Merino girl. The photographs from the time of the kidnapping show the child wearing an identical bracelet. I looked it up on my phone at 4 this morning. The detail was in the original news coverage." He paused. "There's a scar on Elena's left shoulder. She's mentioned it before. She doesn't know where it came from. She's always said it's from before the adoption." He looked at his hands. "The Merino girl had a distinctive birthmark documented in the missing persons file, on her left shoulder." Sandra was very still. "You've done a lot of research in the last 3 hours." "I've been sitting in a waiting room with nothing but time and a phone and 30 years of old news articles one search away." Sandra pulled the photograph toward her and looked at it again. "If this is real, and I'm not saying it is, I'm saying if, then the implications reach a long way. Salvatore Marino is not a small figure. He never was. Even now." She looked up. "The family has spent significant resources over the years on the search. There were 2 false leads in the 90s. Both were handled quietly." "I know. This needs to be verified before it touches Elena, before anyone knows she knows." She said it with the calm emphasis of someone who has worked in law long enough to understand that the difference between knowing something and being known to know it is the difference between safety and exposure. "A private DNA lab. Fastest turnaround available. And we need to know who sent the photograph." "I've been working on that." "How?" "I have a nephew. He's better with these things than I am." Thomas picked up his phone and turned it so Sandra could see the screen. The message came from a prepaid phone, purchased in cash 6 days ago at a store in Lower Manhattan. But the photograph itself, he scrolled, was taken with a professional camera. "The metadata is stripped, but my nephew found a partial timestamp. It was taken at 11:47 a.m. yesterday. Before the party. Hours before." Sandra closed her folio. "Someone has been watching her. Someone who has information and chose this moment to send it." She looked at Thomas directly. "Why this moment? Why last night?" Thomas thought about it. "Maybe they were waiting to see if she was going to stay," he said. "With Marco. Maybe last night resolved that question." The room was quiet. "Whoever sent it," Sandra said, "wanted her to know. And they wanted her to know now, when she had nothing left to lose by finding out." Elena was not sleeping when Thomas came back. She was sitting up, which Dr. Farrow had not explicitly prohibited but had also not encouraged, and she had the photograph in her hand. Thomas had left it with her, and she was looking at her wrist in the image. "The bracelet," she said when Thomas sat down. Not a question. "Yes. My mother always said it was in the bag. When I came to her." She turned her wrist over, looking at the charm. The small bird, not quite a dove, not quite a sparrow, some indeterminate species that a child might have loved. She said whoever left me had packed a bag. Clothes, a stuffed animal I don't remember, and this. She touched the charm with one finger. She said it was the only thing that told her someone had loved me before she did. Thomas didn't say anything. "I looked up the name," Elena said, "this morning, on my phone." She set the photograph down. "I was 4 when she disappeared. I would have been the same age." She looked at the window. "I don't remember Sicily. I don't remember anything. I have a memory of a garden, and hands, large hands, like a man's, and a smell I've never been able to place. But that's not, lots of children. Elena." She stopped. "I've scheduled a DNA sample collection for this afternoon. Sandra Park. She's a patient advocate, discreet, competent. She has a contact at a private lab. Fastest turnaround is 72 hours. Elena looked at him for a long moment. "You did all that this morning?" "Yes." She nodded slowly, the way people nod when they're not really processing the information yet, when they're just storing it somewhere to handle later. "And Marco?" "He's downstairs. He asked to come in." "No." That's what I told him. Good. She smoothed the blanket with both hands, the unconscious gesture of someone restoring order to something small, because the larger things are beyond restoring. He would try to make this about the company, about how it looks. He would... She stopped. Did Bianca come with him? No. Something moved across her face. Not relief. Something more complicated. She's managing things from wherever she is. That's what she does. She manages. Elena's voice was flat, factual. She managed Marco right out of his own company's founding story. She managed every board meeting I was excluded from. She managed the narrative around whatever story they've been building about my mental state. Her jaw was tight. She's very good at managing. Elena. Thomas leaned forward slightly. Whatever is happening with the Marino question, it can't come out yet. Not until we have confirmation. If Marco finds out there's a DNA inquiry, if Bianca finds out, I know. Elena met his eyes. I know how to keep a secret, Thomas. I've been keeping them inside that marriage for 4 years. She said it without bitterness, which was somehow worse than bitterness. Pure worn-down fact. Don't tell anyone. Not even Sandra Park knows the full picture. She knows enough to be careful. Make sure she knows to be careful. Thomas nodded. He stood. At the door, Elena said, "One more thing." He paused. "The watch. My purse. Where is it?" Thomas crossed to the chair in the corner where her coat and purse had been placed when she was admitted. He brought the purse to her. She opened it and reached inside, and when her hand found the watch, she exhaled once, very slowly, just one breath, the particular release of someone who's been holding something that needed releasing. She held it in her palm. The silver was warm from being in the enclosed space. The restored crystal caught the morning light from the window. "I was going to give it to him," she said very quietly. "His father's watch. I thought it might..." She stopped, closed her hand around it. "It doesn't matter." "What do you want to do with it?" She looked at it for another moment. "Keep it," she said. "It's mine now. I paid for it." Quote. Bianca Russo was on her second call of the morning when her assistant, a 26-year-old named Dev, who had been with her for 3 years and who could read a room better than most people twice his age, put a sticky note on the edge of her desk that read, T. Greco made a call at 6 a.m. Lawyer. Hospital staff. Bianca finished the call. She peeled the sticky note off the desk and folded it in half. "How do you know this?" she asked, without looking at Dev. "I have access to the hospital's visitor check-in log through the admin system we've been using for the Stavros due diligence. I didn't ask how you accessed it. I asked how you know it was a lawyer." Dev was quiet for a moment. "Sandra Park. She's listed as a patient advocate, but she holds a JD, environmental law originally. Pivoted to private consulting 8 years ago. She has a specific client list, all high net worth individuals navigating institutional systems." He paused. "Discrete clients." Bianca set the folded note on the desk. "Elena is consulting a lawyer from a hospital bed the morning after Marco made her the punchline of an anniversary speech," she said. "Of course she is." She said it without alarm. What she felt, and she was scrupulously honest with herself about her own emotional states, which was both her greatest strength and the thing that made her genuinely frightening, was not alarm but calibration. The adjusting of a model to account for new data. She had not expected Elena to move this fast. She had expected grief. She had expected the weeks of paralyzed shock that a lesser person might indulge in after a public humiliation of that magnitude. She had expected, perhaps, that Elena's pregnancy would slow her, the physical reality of 31 weeks, the fatigue, the logistics. She had not expected Sandra Park at 6 in the morning. She pulled up Elena's financial profile on her screen, the accounts she knew about, the joint accounts, Marco's business accounts, the household management funds. Then she looked at the flag her own team had placed 2 weeks ago on a secondary account that had shown minimal activity for almost 3 years, and then, 18 months ago, had begun receiving small regular deposits. The account was in Elena's name only. The source of the deposits was a management consulting firm that Bianca's team had traced as far as an LLC registered in Delaware and no further. She had meant to look into it more closely. She looked into it now. It took her team 40 minutes. When the report came back, Bianca sat with it for a long time without speaking. The Delaware LLC traced back to a holding company. The holding company had been established 9 years ago. Its founding documents listed two principals: Marco Belandi, Elena Reeves Belandi. The holding company owned a 14% stake in the entity that controlled Belandi Maritime's parent structure. Elena Belandi, sitting in a hospital bed at 31 weeks pregnant, legally owned 14% of the company that was celebrating its 10th anniversary without her. Bianca closed the report. She looked at Dev. "Get me everything we have on the founding documents of the parent structure," she said. "Every version, every amendment, every signature page." She paused. "And pull the original capitalization records from 2014. Dev was already moving. She turned back to her screen, and for the first time in a very long time, Bianca Russo felt something she did not have much practice managing. She felt like she had miscounted. Marco came back to the hotel at 10. He had not slept. He had sat in the hospital waiting room until 8, driven past the office, turned around in the parking garage without going in, and ended up here. The suite at the Meridian, where he and Bianca had been staying for the week of anniversary events because it had seemed, at the time, like a reasonable logistical decision that he had not examined too closely. Bianca was at the desk with 3 screens open and Dev hovering at a respectful distance with a tablet. She looked at Marco when he came in and said, "Shut the door." He shut it. "Sit down." He sat. She turned one of the screens toward him. He looked at it for a moment, not fully processing what he was seeing, the fatigue and the sleeplessness, and the hospital smell still in his jacket making everything slightly unreal. Then he understood what he was looking at. "She's a founder," Bianca said. Her voice was very controlled. "She's listed as a founding principal. She contributed the initial capitalization, $240,000, which I have now confirmed came from an inheritance she received from her adoptive father in 2013, before either of you put a single dollar into the company's formal structure." She tapped the screen. "She owns 14% of the parent entity. That stake has never been transferred, never been diluted, never been addressed in any of the restructuring agreements from 2017, 2019, or 2022. She looked at him. "Because every time we restructured, we worked around the parent entity level. Because it was easier." "Because it was a formality," Marco said. His voice came out rough. It was not a formality. It was a legal ownership stake that has been generating value for 9 years, and which she has never been paid for, compensated for, bought out of, or informed about in any restructuring material." Bianca's eyes were very steady. "Marco, I need you to understand what this means. She was involved in the early days. She helped. She didn't help. She funded it. The initial capital was hers. The first 3 contracts, I pulled the email records. She negotiated them. Her name is on 2 of the compliance framework filings from 2016. Bianca closed the screen. If she walks into a courtroom with a lawyer who knows what they're doing, she doesn't just get a divorce settlement. She gets standing as a founding shareholder. She can challenge every board decision made without her participation. She can subpoena 10 years of financial records. She folded her hands on the desk. She can potentially challenge the Stavros acquisition. The room was very quiet. "She doesn't know any of this," Marco said. Bianca looked at him for a long moment. "Marco," she said carefully, "she hired Sandra Park this morning at 6 a.m. from a hospital bed." She held his gaze. "Are you certain she doesn't know?" He had no answer for that. "How did she get to a lawyer this fast?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Thomas Greco." Marco stood up. He walked to the window. Manhattan was doing what Manhattan always did, moving, indifferent, enormous, the vast machinery of it grinding forward without reference to what was happening in any particular room. "She has Thomas," he said, almost to himself. "Yes. He has contacts. He knows people. Marco." Bianca's voice was quiet, but the edge in it was unmistakable. "The problem is not Thomas Greco. The problem is that we have spent the last 18 months building a corporate narrative around an acquisition that requires Elena's stake to be either non-existent or uncontested, and it is neither." She paused. "And the problem? Last night you said what you said in front of 400 people and cameras, and she left, and now she's in a hospital with a lawyer and Thomas Greco and 14% of your company. He turned around. What do you want me to do? I want you to let me handle it. Bianca, let me handle it. She said it clearly, without inflection, the way you state an instruction rather than make a request. I need you to go back to the hospital. I need you to be a concerned husband. I need you to not talk to any board members, not answer any questions about the speech last night, and not sign anything. She stood. Can you do that? Marco looked at her. He thought about his father's watch. He'd noticed Elena's purse at the gala, noticed the particular way she'd held it, close to her side, careful. He'd wondered what was in it. He hadn't asked. He hadn't asked about a lot of things. What are you going to do? He said. Bianca turned back to her screens. What I always do, she said. At 2 p.m, a courier arrived at Sandra Park's home office with a manila envelope containing a document that Sandra read once, set down, read again, and then called Thomas Greco about. Someone froze the secondary account, she said. Thomas was in the hospital parking garage. How? Technically, it's a joint account. The original registration listed both names. Marco's legal team has filed a motion claiming the account contains commingled marital assets and requesting a temporary freeze pending divorce proceedings. She paused. Divorce proceedings that, as of 11 this morning, have apparently been formally initiated by Marco's side. Thomas said nothing for a moment. He filed first, he said. His lawyers filed, which means someone moved extremely fast this morning. Sandra's voice was careful, measured. The account freeze also covers Elena's access to the household management funds. She can't access the apartment. She can't access the car service account. She can't… Sandra stopped. Thomas, she's in a hospital bed. She has no access to any funds as of… She checked 10:53 this morning. Thomas stood in the parking garage with the phone against his ear. Can we challenge it? Yes, but not in the next 24 hours. The emergency motion is already in the system. Who's behind this? Not Marco. This isn't Marco's speed. The filing was drafted by a firm called Russo Legal Partners. A pause. Related to Bianca Russo's family. Thomas pressed his hand flat against the concrete wall of the parking garage. Cold. Solid. He needed something solid right now. She's isolated her, he said. Elena's in a hospital. No funds. Devices on the joint account plan. Her phone, Sandra said. Check whether her phone is on the joint plan. Thomas was already moving back inside. He got to Elena's room in 4 minutes. Elena was sitting up, her phone in her hand, staring at the screen with an expression he had seen on her face exactly once before. The morning after she'd discovered that a contract she'd negotiated had been retroactively altered without her signature, back in 2019, the expression of someone processing the specific shape of a betrayal. My phone, she said when he came in. The data's been suspended. I can still make calls on the network, but I can't… She looked up. How did they do that so fast? Bianca, Thomas said. He sat down. He looked at her directly. Elena, we need to move faster than I thought. She held his gaze. Tell me everything, she said. He did. He told her about Sandra Park's call, the account freeze, the divorce filing, the Russo Legal Partners connection. He told her all of it in the flat, sequential way that a man tells you something when he has decided that you need to hear it without softening, because softening it now would cost you time you don't have. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for 30 seconds. Outside the window, the afternoon light was flat and gray, the particular gray of a city that doesn't care what's happening in any specific room. She's trying to establish me as unstable, Elena said. The account freeze, the divorce filing, the phone restriction. She wants a paper trail that shows I was financially dependent, mentally compromised, making irrational decisions. Her voice was steady. She's building a narrative for the board, for the courts. She's been building it for months, the rumors about my mental state, the exclusion from meetings. This is the next chapter. Yes. She doesn't know about the DNA inquiry. No. She doesn't know what's in that photograph. No. Elena looked at the bracelet on her wrist, the bird charm, small and worn and warm from her skin. Then we have one thing she doesn't, she said. One thing that changes every calculation she's making. She looked at Thomas. If I'm Alicia Marino, I'm not an isolated pregnant woman with no family and no resources. I'm the daughter of a man who has been looking for his child for 30 years and who has the kind of resources that make Marco Belandi look like a local business owner. She said it plainly, without drama. Just the arithmetic of it. Bianca is moving against someone she thinks is alone. She doesn't know that 72 hours from now, I might not be alone at all. Thomas held her gaze. The results could come back negative, he said. They could. Then we're back to what we have. Which is enough, Elena said. Sandra's enough. The founding documents are enough. I'm not without ammunition, Thomas. I'm without time. She looked at the window. 72 hours. Can we hold for 72 hours? Thomas thought about the parking garage. The photograph. The way Bianca had moved against Elena's accounts before the body was cold on the marriage. Sandra can file a counter motion tomorrow morning, he said. Emergency basis, medical circumstances. It won't restore everything, but it'll slow the freeze. Do it. Elena set her phone on the bedside table, face down, the same gesture she'd used last night with Marco's calls. Final. And Thomas, she looked at him. Don't tell me it's going to be all right. I don't need that right now. I wasn't going to, he said. He stood and went to the door. Behind him, Elena put her hand over her stomach. Her son, steady, persistent, 31 weeks and refusing to stop. And across the Atlantic, in a hotel room in Palermo, an old man named Salvatore Marino sat with a DNA request form on the table in front of him and a glass of water he hadn't touched. And he pressed his thumb to the paper and he signed his name. And then he sat very still for a long time because he had taught himself, over 30 years of searching, not to want things too badly. He was failing at that, right now, very badly indeed. The DNA results came back in 61 hours, not 72. 61. Sandra Park called Thomas at 4:47 in the morning on the third day, and Thomas was already awake because he had not slept more than 90 minutes at a stretch since the night of the gala, and when he saw Sandra's name on his screen, he sat up on the edge of his bed in the small apartment in Queens where he had lived for 22 years, and he pressed the phone to his ear and he waited. Sandra said two things. She said, "It's confirmed." Then she said, 99.99%. Thomas sat on the edge of his bed for a long moment with his phone in his hand and the pre-dawn quiet of Queens around him. The distant sound of a truck on the avenue, someone's television through the wall, the specific silence of a city that hasn't quite started yet. Then he got up, put on his jacket, and drove to the hospital. Elena was awake when he arrived. She had been awake for most of the night, not because of the contractions, those had stayed quiet, the medication holding, but because of the particular sleeplessness of someone waiting for information they both need and dread. She had the watch in her hand. She'd been holding it off and on for 3 days, the way you hold something that belongs to a different version of your life, trying to understand what it means now. Thomas sat down in the chair beside her bed. He put the printed report on the blanket between them. She looked at it without picking it up. "Tell me," she said. 99.99, he said. The lab used the sample from Salvatore Marino's submission and the buccal swab Sandra collected from you day before yesterday. He paused. "Elena, you're his daughter." She looked at the report. She looked at it for a long time, the way you look at something that is rearranging everything behind your eyes, even though the paper itself is just paper, just numbers, just the bloodless language of science confirming what some part of her had already been sitting with since the moment she'd seen the photograph. She did not cry. She pressed her lips together very tightly, and she turned her face toward the window, and she breathed. 1 breath, 2. The kind of deliberate breathing that is not about calm, but about containing something that doesn't have a shape yet. She pressed her hand against her stomach and felt her son move, that small, insistent motion, and she held on to it. "Does he know?" she asked. Her voice was level, but barely. Sandra contacted the lab liaison in Palermo. He received the confirmation approximately 2 hours ago. Thomas kept his voice steady. "He's already arranged travel. To New York. He'll be here by tomorrow evening." Elena closed her eyes. She was 47 hours post-admission. She had not left the bed except to use the bathroom. She had received 3 visits from Dr. Farrow, 2 from the nursing staff, and 0 from her husband. Marco had sent a text at some point on the second day. She had read it twice and not responded. It had said, I know you're angry. We need to talk about the legal situation. Please call me. The word please had been the worst part of it, the thin coating of it over the machinery underneath. He's going to try to use this, Elena said. Her eyes were still closed. Marco. When he finds out, he's going to try to use it somehow. The identity, the Marino connection. He'll find an angle. He doesn't know yet. He will. She opened her eyes. She looked at Thomas directly. Bianca monitors everything. She has people watching this room, Thomas. I'm not being... She stopped. The woman in the beige coat who's been in the family lounge for 2 days. She's not waiting for a patient. I've seen her twice in the parking garage from this window. Thomas was quiet for a moment. I noticed her. Bianca put her there. Most likely. Then we have maybe 12 hours before she knows about Salvatore's travel. Elena sat up straighter against the pillows. Something had shifted in her face. Not hardness exactly, but the arrival of something that had been on its way for a while. Some core of decision that had finally reached the surface. I need to talk to Sandra. Today. Not a call. In person. She looked at the report on the blanket. And I need you to get me the MacBook. Thomas went still. Which MacBook? The one from the storage unit in Hoboken. The old one from 2014. The one with the original company files. A pause. How do you know about the storage unit in Hoboken? Because I rented it, Elena said. I've been paying for it for 9 years, Thomas. $60 a month from the secondary account. She looked at him with something in her eyes that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one, the expression of someone who had been quietly careful for a very long time. I kept copies of everything, every email, every contract, every capitalization record, every version of every founding document, including the ones that were amended after the fact without my signature. She paused. I kept them because my father, my adoptive father, Harold Reeves, who taught accounting at a community college in Westchester, and who was the most careful man I have ever known, told me when I was 17 years old, keep your records, keep them somewhere they can't be touched, because the person who controls the documents controls the story. Thomas looked at her for a long moment. Harold Reeves was a wise man, he said. He was, she said. Go get the MacBook. Thomas left at 6. At 6:45, before Sandra arrived, before the morning nursing check, before any of the day's machinery engaged, Elena's room door opened and Marco walked in. Not asked in. Walked in. He had found a nurse who didn't know the standing instruction, or had talked his way past one who did. Marco had always been good at talking his way past people. It was one of the first things Elena had loved about him, the ease of it, the way rooms opened for him, and she noted now with a bleak precision that she was done finding that quality charming. He looked terrible. That was the first thing she registered, before the anger, before the defense mechanisms engaged. He looked like 3 days of bad sleep and worse decisions. Unshaved, tie gone, the jacket he'd been wearing at the gala replaced by a dark sweater that she recognized from the back of their closet, which meant he'd gone to the apartment at some point. His eyes were red at the edges, not from crying, from not sleeping. He stood inside the door for a moment, as if waiting for permission to come further. She didn't give it. Elena, you shouldn't be in here. I know. He didn't move back toward the door. I needed to... He stopped, ran one hand across his face, the gesture he always made when the words weren't coming the way he wanted them to, when the performance was failing and he didn't have the backup ready. How is he? The baby. His name is Noah, she said. I've decided. Marco blinked. We were going to, I decided. She held his gaze. He's stable. The medication is working. Dr. Farrow thinks we can make it to 35 weeks, possibly further. Something moved across Marco's face, relief, genuine and unguarded, and she cataloged it with the specific detachment of someone who has learned to note the real thing when it appears in a face that mostly shows her performances. He did love the child. She had never doubted that part. I'm glad, he said. He meant it. Go home, Marco. Elena, the legal situation, I know what Bianca filed, and I need you to know I didn't... You didn't what? Her voice didn't rise. That was the thing. She wasn't shouting, wasn't shaking, wasn't doing any of the things she might have done 3 days ago. She was very, very still. You didn't authorize the account freeze? You didn't initiate divorce proceedings? You didn't know your girlfriend's family law firm was filing motions at 11 a.m. while I was lying in a hospital bed. She paused. Which part didn't you do, Marco? He opened his mouth, closed it. The speech, he said, finally. That night, I need to… Don't. She said it quietly. Don't apologize for the speech right now. Not because I'm not going to need that eventually. I am. But because if you apologize for the speech and then walk out of here and let Bianca keep doing what she's doing, the apology is just a tactic. She looked at him steadily. Is it a tactic? He had no answer. She watched him look for one, the way she'd watched him look for answers for years. The slight delay, the recalibration, the reaching for the version of a response that would work. She'd found it endearing once. She didn't anymore. I'm going to need you to leave, she said. Elena, my lawyer will be here in an hour. Whatever you need to say to me, you can say it through her. She looked at the window. Tell Bianca's person in the family lounge that she can go home. She's not going to hear anything useful today. The silence that followed was the specific silence of someone realizing they have been more seen through than they understood. Marco left. The door closed. Elena sat in the quiet and pressed her hand against her stomach and breathed, and from the window she could see the gray November sky going slightly lighter at the edges, and she thought about Harold Reeves in his kitchen in Westchester, drinking coffee and reading through her college applications with a red pen, making careful small notes in the margins, not correcting, just noting. And she thought about what he'd said when she'd asked him why he bothered being so precise about everything. Because imprecision costs more than the time you saved, he'd said. Always. Without exception. She was going to need that now. Sandra arrived at 8 with Dev's analysis. She had brought him in, carefully, for document review only, and the preliminary counter-motion for the account freeze, and a second folder that she set on the bed with the specific deliberateness of someone delivering something they want you to see clearly. This morning, Sandra said, sitting in the chair Thomas had left, Bianca Russo's team submitted a supplementary filing to the divorce motion. It includes a medical opinion. She opened the folder. A psychiatrist named Dr. Alan Vance. I've looked him up. He has a private practice in Midtown. Significant corporate consulting history. 2 previous cases where his opinion supported incapacity findings in high-asset divorce proceedings. She paused. His opinion, submitted this morning, states that Elena Belandi exhibits symptoms consistent with a stress-induced psychiatric disorder, potentially exacerbated by pregnancy, and recommends that decisions regarding her legal standing and asset access be subject to medical review. Elena read the document. She read it twice, the way Thomas read things, the way Harold had taught her. She's trying to have me declared incompetent, she said. Not formally. Not yet. But this creates a record. If she can establish even a preliminary basis, an assigned psychiatric opinion submitted to a court filing is not nothing, she can use it to delay your legal standing in the divorce proceedings, potentially through the birth and recovery period, which buys her months. Sandra's voice was even, but her eyes were not. It's a specific strategy. It requires a judge to take it seriously enough to request a formal evaluation, which creates more delay, more process, more time for Bianca to consolidate control of the company, Elena said. Yes. She found out about my stake. She found out about it, and she's moving to neutralize you before you can exercise it. Sandra closed the folder. The psychiatric angle is the fastest way to do that. It doesn't have to succeed. It just has to slow you down. Elena sat with this. She thought about the woman in the beige coat in the family lounge. She thought about Bianca at the desk with hand on Marco's jacket at the gala. She thought about the word strategic and what it had meant when Marco used it, what it actually meant. She's been planning this for longer than I understood, Elena said. This isn't reactive. This isn't Bianca responding to me dropping my wedding ring. This is… She stopped. How long has she had Dr. Vance's opinion prepared? Sandra hesitated. The document is dated, she said. 6 weeks ago. The room was quiet. 6 weeks ago, Elena had still been attending board dinners. 6 weeks ago, she had still been trying to fix something. 6 weeks ago, she had been searching for a watch in a New Jersey storage unit and paying a man in Brooklyn to restore it. Bianca had been having her declared mentally unfit 6 weeks ago. Elena set the folder down. She looked at the bird charm on her bracelet. I need to tell you something, she said. And I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you changes the legal landscape completely. Sandra waited. Elena told her about Salvatore Marino. She told her about the photograph, the DNA sample, the results that had come back at 4:47 that morning. She told her about the bracelet and the scar and the garden she remembered as a 4-year-old. She told it plainly, in sequence, the way Harold had taught her to present information, chronologically, without editorializing, letting the facts carry the weight. Sandra listened without interrupting. When Elena finished, Sandra was quiet for a long moment. "If this is confirmed," she started. "It is confirmed. I have the report." Sandra looked at the report Thomas had left on the blanket. She picked it up. She read it with the careful speed of someone trained to extract essential data rapidly. She set it down. "Elena," she said, "a legally verified identity as Alessia Marino, the daughter of Salvatore Marino, transforms your position in every proceeding Bianca has initiated." She was thinking aloud now. Elena could hear the structure of it building in real time. "It establishes a family connection with significant legal resources. It potentially opens a separate line of inquiry into the original kidnapping, which, if Bianca's family has any connection to that event, does Russo Capital have a connection to the Marino family?" Sandra looked at her. "That's the question I need to research," she said carefully. "That's the question that, if the answer is yes, changes everything, for Bianca, criminally." They looked at each other. "Research it," Elena said. "What?" Thomas came back at 10 with the MacBook in a backpack he'd had since his service days, gray canvas, worn at the straps. He also came back with something he hadn't been sent to get, the expression of a man who has learned something in transit and is deciding how to present it. Elena saw it immediately. "What?" He sat down. He put the backpack on the floor. He laced his hands together, and it was that gesture, the careful lacing of his hands, the settling of weight, that told her it was bad before the words did. "My nephew," he said. "He's been running the prepaid phone, the one the message came from. Don't go home." He paused. He found the purchase record, cash transaction, Lower Manhattan, 6 days before the gala. He looked at her. "The store has external security footage. The person who bought the phone." He took out his phone and turned it to face her. The image was grainy, the angle was bad, but it was clear enough. It was a man she didn't recognize, late 60s, silver hair, dressed well but not ostentatiously, the particular understated quality of old money that doesn't need to announce itself. "Do you know him?" Thomas asked. "No?" She leaned forward slightly, looking at the image. "Who is he?" "His name is Aldo Gallo," Thomas said. "He is, or was until 8 years ago, the chief financial officer of Russo Capital." The silence was complete. Elena sat back. She looked at Thomas. "Bianca's family company," she said. "Yes." "He bought the phone that sent me the warning." "Yes." "He told me not to go home." "Yes." She turned this over. Someone inside Bianca's operation had warned her, someone connected to Russo Capital, someone with enough access to know she was in danger that night, had bought a prepaid phone and sent her 5 words. "Don't go home. They're waiting." "He wanted me to run," she said. "Not to fight, to run." "Or he wanted you safe enough to eventually be a problem for Bianca," Thomas said. "Those aren't the same thing, but they might lead to the same action. Can you reach him?" "I've been trying. His personal phone goes to voicemail. His listed address in the village has been vacant for 3 months. The building super said he moved out suddenly." Thomas looked at his hands. "Elena, if Aldo Gallo sent you that warning, it means someone inside Russo Capital was afraid of what Bianca was planning for you that night. Afraid enough to warn you. Afraid enough to then disappear." The weight of that settled over the room. "What was waiting for me at the apartment?" she said. "I don't know." "Yes, you do," she said quietly. "You've been sitting on that since the parking garage, Thomas. What do you think it was?" He was quiet for a long time. "I think," he said, choosing every word, "that Bianca had a plan for that night that required you to be somewhere controllable. That the gala was designed to push you toward a specific behavior, leaving, going home alone, in distress. And that whatever was waiting at the apartment was meant to complete the narrative she needed." He looked at her. A pregnant woman in a psychiatric crisis, alone in her apartment, having left a public event after a public breakdown. He stopped. What comes after that narrative depends on what she was prepared to put in place. An involuntary hold, Elena said. It came out flat. If the right people were there, medical personnel, documentation, it would have accelerated every timeline she's working on, immediately. Elena pressed her hand against her stomach. Her son moved. She closed her eyes for 3 seconds. When she opened them, her face had changed. Not dramatically, not the way it changes in films, the sudden steeling of a jaw, the cinematic resolution. More like something that had been slightly out of alignment had corrected itself, very quietly, without announcement. "I need Salvatore Marino in this room," she said, "before Bianca finds out he's coming, before Marco's lawyers can file anything else, before that psychiatrist's opinion goes anywhere near a judge." She looked at Thomas. "How far out is he?" "Sandra got word this morning. He landed at JFK 20 minutes ago." Elena blinked. "He moved up the flight." "He moved up when the results confirmed." Thomas paused. "He didn't wait. Sandra said he was on a plane within 4 hours of confirmation." She sat with that for a moment. A man who had been searching for his daughter for 30 years, who had received a DNA confirmation at 2 in the morning Palermo time and had been on a plane by 6. She had expected to have more time to prepare, to decide what she wanted to say, to build the walls she needed built before she let someone new inside them. She did not have that time. "Okay," she said. "Bring him, boss." Salvatore Marino arrived at the hospital at 1:15 in the afternoon. He came without a retinue. That was the first thing Thomas noted, and reported to Elena afterward, when he went to the lobby to meet him. One man, a driver who stayed with the car. Salvatore himself, carrying a small cardboard box, dressed in a dark coat and moving through the hospital lobby with the particular quality of a man who has learned to make himself unobtrusive, despite the kind of face that doesn't allow it. Strong-featured, weathered, the face of someone who has spent decades being looked at and has never entirely made peace with it. He was 67 years old. He looked like someone who had carried something very heavy for a very long time. Thomas brought him to the door of Elena's room and stopped. "She knows you're here." Salvatore looked at the door. His hands, Thomas noticed, were not steady. "Does she—" he started. Stopped. "Is she— She wants to meet you," Thomas said. "That's all I can tell you. What happens after that is between you." Salvatore nodded. He went in. Elena had positioned herself sitting upright in the bed, the report on the nightstand where it could be seen. She had combed her hair. She did not know why that detail had felt important. It was not vanity, not exactly, more the instinct toward dignity that her mother had modeled her entire childhood, the insistence on presenting yourself as a full person regardless of the circumstances you'd been reduced to. The door opened. And Elena Belandi, who did not cry when Marco humiliated her in front of 400 people, who did not cry when she heard her son's heartbeat dipping on the monitor at 3 a.m., who had held herself together through 3 days of legal assault and medical uncertainty and the complete dismantling of the life she'd built, looked at the face of Salvatore Marino for the first time and recognized something. Not a memory, not a face she'd seen before. Something more structural, the shape of a jaw, the set of the eyes, the specific angle of the brow that she had looked at in mirrors her entire life and assumed was simply her own face, unique to her, belonging to no one else. It was not unique to her. It was his. Salvatore stopped just inside the door. He looked at her. Whatever he had prepared to say, and she could see that he had prepared something, could see the careful architecture of it behind his eyes, the sentences he had been building for 30 years for this specific moment. It left him completely. He stood there. He was holding the small cardboard box against his chest with both arms, the way you hold something precious by holding it tightly against the thing that hurts. He started. His voice broke on the single syllable. He stopped, pressed his lips together, looked at the ceiling for a moment, the gesture of a man trying to locate control of himself in the general vicinity of his face. Elena watched him. She thought about what it cost a man to lose something for 30 years and then stand in front of it. "Sit down," she said. Her voice was not unkind. "Please." He sat in the chair beside the bed. He put the box on his knee and held it with both hands and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and for a moment neither of them said anything because there was nothing that could be said that would be adequate, and they both understood that. "I didn't know," he said. Finally. quietly. I want you to know that we never stopped looking. There were years where we had nothing, and years where we had false information, and every time he stopped. I'm not asking you to believe that. I just needed to say it. I believe it, she said. He looked at her carefully, as if checking for something. Why? He said. Because a man who didn't care wouldn't be here, she said. He'd have sent lawyers, maybe a letter. She looked at the box. What's in the box? He looked down at it. He opened it with the particular care of someone handling something that cannot be replaced. Inside was a pair of small shoes, white leather, child-sized, with small buckles on the straps, worn at the toes. One of the buckles was slightly bent. Elena looked at them. Something happened in her chest that she didn't have a name for. Your mother bought them, Salvatore said, in a shop in Palermo. You'd only just learned to walk properly without holding on to things. He stopped. She kept them. After. He closed the box. I don't know what I thought. It seemed wrong to come empty-handed, and everything else I had was... He stopped again. Lawyers, documents, those weren't... No, Elena said. They weren't. The room was very quiet. I have questions, Elena said. A lot of them, and I'm not able to be your daughter today. I don't know if I can be that yet. I need you to understand that. I do. But I need your help. She held his gaze. There's a woman named Bianca Russo whose family company is called Russo Capital. I need to know if that name means anything to you. Salvatore went very still. It was a specific stillness, not the stillness of someone searching their memory, but the stillness of someone who has already found the thing being asked about and is deciding what to do with it. Elena watched his face. It means something, she said. His jaw tightened. Yes. Tell me. He set the box on the floor. He put his hands on his knees. He looked at Elena, his daughter, 31 weeks pregnant in a hospital bed, who had spent 3 days being systematically dismantled by a woman whose family name had just produced a physical reaction in him that he couldn't completely conceal. And he made a decision. Russo Capital, he said slowly, was run, in its original form, by a man named Emilio Russo, Bianca's father. He paused. Emilio Russo was, for a period in the early 1990s, involved in the movement of certain assets out of Sicily during a period of significant legal scrutiny of several shipping families. He paused again, including mine. Elena was completely still. He had access, Salvatore said, to information about my family, about our movements, about... He stopped. About where Alessia was, on the day she disappeared. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Elena had ever heard. Are you telling me, she said very carefully, that Emilio Russo, Bianca's father, had a connection to what happened to me? Salvatore looked at her. His hands on his knees were not shaking. They were very still, the stillness of someone who has controlled himself for a very long time and is not going to stop now, regardless of what the moment requires of him. I have never been able to prove it, he said. In 30 years, I have never had enough to bring to anyone who could act on it. He held her eyes. I always believed there was a connection. I was told once by someone who has since died that the kidnapping was arranged to destabilize my family during the asset restructuring, that it was commissioned. He stopped. I could never get further than that. Elena looked at the report on her nightstand. She looked at the bird charm on her wrist. She thought about Bianca's hand on Marco's jacket, about the psychiatric opinion dated 6 weeks ago, about Aldo Gallo buying a prepaid phone in Lower Manhattan because he was afraid of what his employer's daughter was planning. She thought about a 4-year-old girl with white leather shoes. Then we're going to get further, she said. Her voice was very quiet and very certain, and it did not shake at all. And Salvatore Marino looked at his daughter for the first time in 30 years and saw something in her face that he recognized, not from the photographs, not from the age progression images the investigators had generated over the decades, but from a woman he had loved very much and lost too early. He saw his wife. He looked away. He pressed one hand over his mouth for a moment. Then he straightened. Tell me what you need, he said. And outside the hospital, in a car parked on the street below, the woman in the beige coat raised her phone to her ear, and on the other end, Bianca Russo listened without speaking, and when the woman finished her report, Salvatore Marino just went into her room. He came from the airport. He was carrying something. Bianca sat at her desk with 3 screens in front of her and the Stavros acquisition document spread across the glass surface. And she understood, with the particular cold clarity that was her defining quality, that the calculation she had been running for 18 months had just been built on a foundation she had not known was sand. She set her phone face down on the desk. She looked at the screens. And for the first time in a very long time, Bianca Russo had to start over. Bianca moved fast. That was the thing Elena had always understood about her intellectually, but was now watching in real time. The speed of her. Most people, when a foundation shifts beneath them, take a moment. They pause. They absorb. Bianca did not absorb. She recalibrated mid-fall and landed running, and by the time the woman in the beige coat was still on the phone reporting Salvatore's arrival, Bianca was already 3 moves ahead of where she'd been standing. Sandra Park found out at 7 that evening. She called Thomas from the elevator on her way back to Elena's floor, her voice carrying the specific compressed urgency of someone who has learned to deliver bad news efficiently. Bianca's team filed an emergency injunction 2 hours ago. They're seeking a temporary restraining order against Salvatore Marino on the basis that his contact with Elena constitutes undue influence on a vulnerable party in active medical care. She paused. They're also claiming his presence in the United States is connected to an ongoing federal investigation into Marino Shipping's European operations. Thomas stopped walking. Is it? There's an investigation. It's preliminary. It's 2 years old and nothing has been filed. But it exists, and Bianca's lawyers found it, and they're using it to paint Salvatore as a bad actor, inserting himself into a domestic legal dispute for financial reasons. Another pause. The judge assigned to the TRO request has a history with corporate cases. He's inclined toward documented evidence over testimony, which means if we don't respond with something concrete by 9 a.m. tomorrow, Salvatore gets removed from the building and potentially subpoenaed before we can… Sandra, Thomas was already moving toward Elena's room. Tell me what we need. The MacBook, the founding documents, and whatever Salvatore has on Russo Capital's historical operations. Her voice dropped slightly. If there's a connection between Emilio Russo and the kidnapping 30 years ago, anything documentable, anything at all, I need it tonight. Because right now, Bianca is painting this as a powerful foreign businessman exploiting a vulnerable pregnant woman, and without a counter-narrative, that's what a judge is going to see. Thomas pushed open the door to Elena's room. Elena and Salvatore looked up simultaneously. They had been sitting with the MacBook open between them on the bed tray. Elena typing, Salvatore reading from a document he'd produced from his coat pocket. A handwritten list of names that Thomas could see from across the room was old. The paper yellowed at the edges, the ink faded. Tell me, Elena said. She'd heard enough of Thomas's expression to know it was already happening. He told her. She listened without moving. When he finished, she looked at Salvatore. They know you're here. I assumed they would. His voice was even. He folded the list carefully and returned it to his coat pocket. What's on your list for tonight? Documents, Elena said. The founding capitalization records from 2014, the original contract files, the amended versions of the 2017 restructuring agreement, the ones with my signature replaced. She looked at the MacBook screen. And this. She turned the screen toward Thomas. It was an email chain. Long, 60, 70 messages. The kind of chain that accumulates over years when people stop starting new threads and just keep replying to the same route. The earliest message was dated March 2015. The sender was Elena's email address. The recipient was a board member named Richard Chu, who had been on Belandi Maritime's advisory board since the beginning and who had retired 2 years ago to Connecticut. Richard kept everything, Elena said. He was meticulous. He used to print his emails and file them. She looked at Thomas. He still has paper copies of every communication from the founding period, including 3 emails in which I am clearly identified as a founding partner, negotiating on behalf of the company, with Marco copied. She paused. Including 1 email in which Marco explicitly describes me as co-founder in communication with our first major client. Thomas looked at the screen. Does Richard know what's happening? Not yet. Elena closed the MacBook. Call him, tonight. I need his paper files, scanned, photographed, whatever he can do fastest, before 9 a.m. She looked at Salvatore. And I need whatever you have on Emilio Russo. The names, the dates, the connection to the kidnapping. She held his gaze. I know you've been protecting that information. I know you had reasons. But right now, Bianca is using her family's legal infrastructure to remove you from this building. And the only thing that stops that is proving that the Russo family has something to hide that goes a lot further back than a divorce dispute. Salvatore sat with his hands on his knees. Some of what I have, he said carefully, has never been given to any authority. There are reasons for that. I understand. If it surfaces in a legal context, Salvatore. She used his name for the first time. He heard it. She saw him hear it, the slight tightening around his eyes, the way a person responds to their name in their child's mouth for the first time. Whatever you've been protecting by keeping it quiet, Bianca already knows it. She's been living with it her whole life. The only person it's been hidden from is me. She held his gaze. Give it to Sandra. Tonight. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached back into his coat and produced a second document. Not the handwritten list this time, but a folded manila envelope, thick with paper, sealed with a strip of tape that had been applied and removed and reapplied. So many times the adhesive was nearly gone. He held it in both hands for a moment, looking at it. I've been carrying this for 11 years, he said, in one form or another. He held it out. Elena took it. Bob. The night was the longest Thomas Greco had spent since his service days, and he had spent some long nights in his service days. Sandra worked from the hospital's family consultation room, which she had commandeered through the patient advocacy office, with the specific bureaucratic confidence of someone who knows which forms to fill out and in what order. She had a laptop, a portable scanner she'd sent Dev to retrieve from her office, and Richard Chu on a video call from his study in Connecticut, where the man was in his bathrobe at 9 p.m. systematically feeding paper documents through the scanner he used for his taxes. This one, Richard said, holding a printed email up to his camera. March 14, 2015. Marco writes, and I'm reading directly, Elena and I have agreed that the compliance framework she's designed will become the structural basis for all future regulatory filings. As co-founder, she has final sign-off authority on governance documentation. Richard lowered the paper and looked into the camera. Sandra, what is happening? We'll explain everything when we can, Sandra said. Keep scanning. Thomas sat in the corner of the consultation room with the manila envelope's contents spread across the table in front of him. Salvatore's documents, which Sandra had photographed but left with Thomas to organize, while she managed the scanning operation. He worked through them methodically, the way he approached everything, chronologically, without jumping ahead, building the sequence before drawing conclusions. The first section was correspondence. Letters. Actual physical letters. The kind people sent before everything became digital, between Emilio Russo and a man named Carmine De Luca, who a 20-minute search on Thomas's phone identified as a logistics coordinator who had worked for 3 different Sicilian shipping companies in the early 90s before disappearing from public record in 1997. The letters discussed asset movements, routes, timing. They used language that was businesslike and specific, and to Thomas's eye deliberately constructed to be deniable in isolation. Each letter individually readable as normal commercial correspondence. The criminality only visible when you read them in sequence and understood what the assets being discussed actually were. The second section was harder. It was a handwritten account, 12 pages, in Italian, in a hand Thomas couldn't read. He photographed each page and sent them to a number Salvatore had given him. A woman in Palermo who had worked for the Marino family for 40 years and who was, according to Salvatore, the most reliable translator he knew. She called back in 20 minutes. She read it to him over the phone in English, slowly, pausing to find the right words. By page 4, Thomas had stopped taking notes because his hand wasn't moving fast enough, and he'd switched to recording the call. By page 8, he understood what Salvatore had been carrying for 11 years. The account was written by Carmine De Luca, dated 1996, 1 year before he disappeared. It described in specific detail an arrangement made in late 1993 between Emilio Russo and 2 men whose names Thomas didn't recognize. He would look them up later and find that both had died within 5 years of the document's date, to destabilize the Marino family's legal standing during a period of federal scrutiny by eliminating Salvatore's ability to focus on business. The document used the word eliminare, which the translator rendered as remove from the picture in context. It described the selection of a specific method, Not violence against Salvatore directly, which would have drawn too much attention, but the removal of something he valued more than his own safety. His daughter, Alessia, aged 4. The document described the payment made to the two men. It described the route by which the child was moved, out of Sicily, through 2 intermediary locations, into a placement that was designed to be untraceable. The placement itself was described only as Sistemata negli Stati Uniti, arranged in the United States. Thomas stopped the recording. He sat in the consultation room for 2 full minutes without moving. Then he stood up and walked to Sandra's end of the table and said, very quietly, "Stop what you're doing and listen to me." Sandra looked at his face and stopped. He told her what was in the document. Sandra was still for a long moment. Then she said, "This is not a family law matter anymore." "No. This is criminal, 30 years old, but the kidnapping of a minor, depending on jurisdiction and statute of limitations questions." "Sandra," Thomas looked at her. "Bianca grew up in her father's house. She ran her father's company after he stepped back. She has spent 18 months systematically dismantling the life of the woman her father had kidnapped." He paused. "Whether she knew or didn't know, and I think she knew, she has been benefiting from it. And she has been trying to make sure Elena never had the resources or the standing to find out." The consultation room was very quiet. "I need to call someone," Sandra said. "Who?" "Someone who can file a federal preservation order on the Russo Capitol records before Bianca's team gets there first." She was already pulling up her phone. "Once this document is in play, she is going to move to destroy everything that corroborates it. We have maybe hours." Thomas looked at the clock on the wall. It was 11:47 p.m. Elena did not sleep. She had sent Salvatore to a hotel, Thomas's suggestion, for safety, for the appearance of separation that might help with the TRO. And she had lain in the dark with her son's heartbeat on the monitor beside her and the watch in her hand, and she had gone through it, all of it. The timeline she'd been building in her head since the photograph, since the results, since the moment Salvatore had said Russo Capitol and gone still. She had been taken from her father's house when she was 4 years old. She had spent 31 years not knowing who she was. She had been adopted by people who had loved her genuinely, without reservation, who had given her everything they had, and she would never reduce that or reframe it or set it aside. Harold and Diane Reeves had been real. That love had been real. But underneath it, underneath the whole architecture of the life she'd built, there was a crime. Someone had decided, for business reasons, to take a child, and that child had grown up and had gone to college and had met a man and had built a company and had ended up in a hospital bed in Manhattan at 31 weeks pregnant while the daughter of the man who'd ordered the crime tried to have her declared mentally incompetent. Elena looked at the ceiling. She thought about the white leather shoes in the cardboard box. She thought about Salvatore's face when he'd seen her. She thought about what it cost a man to lose something that way. Not to death, which is terrible but carries its own finality, but to the specific ongoing agony of not knowing, of wondering, of every age progression image and every false lead and every year that passes while you carry a folded piece of paper in your coat pocket with names on it. She pressed her hand against her stomach. Noah moved. She thought, "I know what you're fighting for now, both of us." Marco came at midnight. This time, Elena didn't have the energy to turn him away, and something in Thomas's voice when he'd called her, a particular exhaustion, the sound of someone who needs the other parties to stop creating new variables for one night, had made her say, "Fine, let him in, 10 minutes. Marco came in and sat in the chair and looked at her and said nothing for a long moment. He looked worse than he had that morning. The stubble was past the point of appearing deliberate and into the territory of actual collapse. His eyes had the quality of someone who has been looking at things he didn't want to see. "She lied to me," he said. Elena waited. "About the founding documents, about the restructuring, about—" He stopped. He pressed his hands against his knees, the gesture Elena recognized from years of watching him process things he found unacceptable. "About a lot of things." "Yes," Elena said. "I didn't know about the psychiatric filing." "I believe you." She said it simply, without warmth or coldness. A factual assessment. "That's not the kind of thing she would have told you." "Elena." His voice cracked slightly on the second syllable. "I need you to know, Marco." She looked at him directly.
I cannot do this tonight. I need you to hear that not as me being cold, but as a genuine statement of capacity. I have nothing left for this conversation right now." She held his gaze. "What I need from you, the only thing I need from you tonight, is for you to think about where you actually stand. Not where Bianca has told you you stand, where you actually are." She paused. "Because tomorrow is going to require you to make a choice, and you are not going to be able to stay in the middle of it." He looked at her. "What's happening tomorrow?" he said. "Things are moving," she said. "Fast. If you want to know more, call Sandra Park in the morning. Not Bianca's lawyers." "Sandra." She looked at the window. "Go home, Marco." He stood. At the door he stopped. "The baby. Noah." He said the name like he was trying it out, learning the shape of it. He's strong," Elena said. "He's stubborn." She almost smiled. "He gets that from both of us, probably." Marco nodded. He left. Elena closed her eyes. She had 4 hours before dawn. At 3 a.m., Sandra filed the federal preservation motion through a contact at the U.S. Attorney's Office, who had been, in a previous professional life, her supervisor and who was, upon receiving her call at 2:30 in the morning, both displeased and immediately attentive. At 4 a.m., 2 federal agents arrived at the offices of Russo Capital in Midtown and served the preservation order. They were there when Bianca's overnight security team was there, which meant Bianca knew within 15 minutes. At 4:17 a.m., Bianca called Marco. He didn't answer. At 4:22 a.m., she called the Belandi Maritime Board Chairman, a man named Gerald Foss, who was 71 years old and had been on the board since year 3, and who was, upon receiving her call, also displeased and immediately attentive in a different way. The way of a man who suddenly understands that something he has been adjacent to may be significantly larger than he understood. At 5 a.m., Gerald Foss called Sandra Park. Sandra, who had not slept, answered on the first ring. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. When it ended, Sandra called Thomas. "The board is convening an emergency session," she said. 9 a.m. They want Elena to present. Thomas looked at the clock. "She's in a hospital bed." "I know." A pause. "She's going to have to decide." Thomas went to Elena's room. She was awake. She had been awake. The monitor beside her was showing stable readings. Noah's heartbeat steady and strong, the contractions quiet, the medication holding. He told her about the board session. She was quiet for a moment. "Can we get Dr. Farrow in here?" she said. Dr. Farrow arrived at 5:45, sleep-deprived and professional. She reviewed the overnight readings. She looked at Elena with the particular assessment of someone calculating risk against likelihood. "You want to leave the building," she said, "for approximately 3 hours. I'll have medical personnel present. I'll arrange it." "Elena," Dr. Farrow's voice was careful. "At 31 weeks, with the episode you had 4 days ago, I know the risks. I need you to say them back to me." Elena said them back. Clearly, specifically, without minimizing. She had always been honest with Dr. Farrow, and she was not going to stop now. Dr. Farrow looked at her for a long moment. A wheelchair. An EMT in the room the entire time. If there is any sign of contractions, you leave immediately. No argument. She held Elena's gaze. "And I want your word." "You have it," Elena said. The Belandi Maritime Boardroom was on the 34th floor of a building in Midtown that Elena had visited approximately 200 times over 10 years, including the day the lease was signed, which she had negotiated. She arrived in a wheelchair, Thomas behind her, Sandra on her right, a young EMT named Carlos on her left, who had the particular composure of someone who has seen enough genuine emergencies to treat everything that isn't one with steady calm. She had changed into clothes Thomas had brought from the apartment, dark trousers, a gray sweater, flat shoes. She had the MacBook in a bag on her lap. She had the watch in her coat pocket. She did not know why she'd brought the watch. She'd thought about leaving it in the room and had not been able to. The boardroom held 8 people when they arrived. Gerald Foss at the head of the table, 6 other board members Elena recognized with varying degrees of familiarity, and 1 person she had not expected. Marco. I was sitting at the far end of the table, not at the head, not in any of the power seats. At the far end, which she understood immediately was a choice and not an accident. He looked at her when she came in.
She looked back. Neither of them said anything. Bianca was not in the room. That was the first thing Elena checked. Ms. Belandi, Gerald said. He was a tall man who had the dignity of someone who had made a career of being in difficult rooms and understanding that his behavior in them was what people would remember. Thank you for coming. We understand the circumstances. I appreciate the board's time, Elena said. Her voice carried in the room the way she'd trained it to carry in rooms, back in the early days when she'd been the one running meetings before Marco had grown into the part and she'd stepped back. I'll try to be efficient. She opened the MacBook. She began. She did not editorialize. She did not make speeches. She presented documents in chronological order, founding capitalization records, email communications identifying her as co-founder, contract files with her name on them, the amended restructuring documents showing alterations made without her signature, the ownership stake that had never been addressed or compensated. She let the documents speak. Harold Reeves had taught her that too. The documents either say what they say or they don't, and if they say it, you don't need to perform around them. The board was quiet. Gerald asked 3 questions. Another member, a woman named Patricia Osei, who had joined the board in 2020 and whom Elena had always found precise and fair, asked 2 more. The others were mostly silent in the way of people who are recalibrating their understanding of something they thought they understood. Marco said nothing. When Elena finished the documents, she looked at the board. I'm not here to destroy this company, she said. I want to say that clearly because I imagine some of you are wondering. She looked at Gerald. This company was built on real work, some of it Marco's, a significant portion of it mine. It serves real people, crews, port workers, logistics contractors, administrative staff. I have no interest in burning it down. She paused. What I'm asking this board to do is look at what the documents show and act accordingly. That's all. Gerald looked at his fellow board members. He looked at Marco. Marco had his hands flat on the table. He was looking at the surface, not at anyone in the room. His jaw was tight. Marco, Gerald said, do you dispute any of the documentation presented? The room was very quiet. Marco looked up. He looked at Elena first, a long, complicated look that she held without moving. Then he looked at Gerald. No, he said, I don't dispute it. The word landed in the room and settled. Patricia Osei made a note. The board member to Gerald's left shifted in his chair. Gerald himself looked at the table for a moment, then back at Elena. I'd like to call a brief recess, he said. 15 minutes. Of course, Elena said. The board members moved toward the side corridor. Marco stood. He walked toward the door and then, at the last moment, he stopped. He stood with his back to the room for a moment. Elena watched him. He turned around. He walked to where she was sitting and he crouched down so they were at eye level, which she had not expected. It was not a gesture he made. It was not in his vocabulary of movement, and the unexpectedness of it caught her off guard in a way that the entire preceding hour had not. I want to tell you something, he said, very quietly, just to her. Not for the board, not for Sandra, just, he looked at her. I know what I did, not just the speech, the whole 4 years of it. I know what I built myself into. He held her gaze. I'm not asking for anything. I just needed you to know that I know. Elena looked at him. She thought about the watch in her pocket, about a man she'd loved before the money came, about the version of Marco that had existed once, or that she had believed had existed, which might not have been the same thing. I know you know, she said. That's not nothing. He nodded. He stood. He walked out. Carlos, the EMT, appeared at her elbow. How are you doing? Fine? She pressed her hand against her stomach under the table. Noah was quiet, steady. We're fine. She looked at the door. Through the glass panel, she could see Gerald in the corridor with 2 other board members, talking in the close, rapid way of people managing something urgent. She could see Sandra on her phone. She could see Thomas standing by the elevator bank, watching the corridor with the patience of a man who has learned that watching is a form of action. She thought about Bianca. Bianca was not here. Bianca had known this meeting was happening and had not come, which meant she was doing something else, somewhere else, right now, with the time Elena was spending in this boardroom. The thought arrived with a cold specificity. She pulled out her phone and texted Thomas. Where is Bianca? He looked at the text. She watched him look at it through the glass. He typed something back. working on it. The board members were filtering back into the room. Gerald resumed his seat. He looked at Elena with the expression of a man who has reached the end of a deliberation and is about to speak. "Ms. Belandi," he said, "the board has reached a preliminary position." Sandra came back in and stood at Elena's shoulder. "We are prepared to recognize your founding shareholder status and restore your access to the relevant documentation and accounts pending a formal review." He paused. "We are also prepared to place Marco's executive authority on interim suspension while that review occurs." Another pause. "And we are formally requesting that all agreements involving Russo Capital be suspended pending the completion of the federal preservation process currently underway." The room was quiet. Elena kept her face still. "Thank you," she said. Gerald nodded. He looked down at his papers. "There is one additional matter." He looked up. "We received a communication 40 minutes ago from Bianca Russo. She has tendered her resignation as executive advisor, effective immediately." He said it with the particular neutrality of someone delivering information whose implications he is still processing. She also states that she is leaving New York and has retained separate legal counsel. Elena's phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. "Thomas." One line. "Bianca is at the airport, JFK. International departures." Elena looked at the text. She looked at Sandra. Sandra had seen it over her shoulder. Their eyes met. The federal preservation order covered documents. It covered records. It covered company assets. It did not— Sandra's expression confirmed what Elena was thinking. It did not prevent Bianca Russo from boarding a plane. "Gerald." Elena looked at the board chairman. "The federal contacts Sandra has been working with, can she reach them in the next 15 minutes? Gerald looked at Sandra. "What would you need?" 15 minutes and a conference room," Sandra said. Gerald stood. "Use my office." Sandra was already moving. Elena looked at Thomas through the glass and made a small motion with her head toward the elevator, and he was already on his phone before she finished the gesture, his jaw set, moving fast and quiet the way he moved when things required it. Carlos put a hand on the arm of her wheelchair. "Mrs. Belandi." His voice was low and steady. "Your blood pressure." She looked at the monitor on her wrist that he'd kept attached since they'd left the hospital. It was elevated. Not dangerously, but elevated. She pressed her hand flat against her stomach. Noah moved. She breathed. "Give me 60 seconds, she said. Carlos gave her 60 seconds. She used them to look at the boardroom around her, the long table, the 34th floor windows showing gray November Manhattan, the chairs where people who had benefited from her work had sat for 10 years without knowing the full truth of what they were benefiting from. She looked at the chair where Marco had sat. She looked at the door Gerald had gone through. She thought about a 4-year-old girl in white leather shoes. She thought about 30 years. She thought about what it meant that the person who had tried hardest to make her disappear, quietly, legally, thoroughly, was now running. Running meant afraid. Afraid meant the documents were real, and Bianca knew it. Elena straightened in the wheelchair. "Okay," she said to Carlos. "Let's go." She came through the boardroom door into the corridor, and Sandra was already in Gerald's office, on the phone, and Thomas was by the elevator with his phone to his ear, and his face carrying the expression she had learned to read over 11 years as moving, but it is close. She rolled to the door of Gerald's office, and Sandra looked at her and covered the phone with one hand. "They can issue a request," Sandra said, fast and low, "to delay boarding, 30-minute hold while they assess the preservation order's scope. But they need something specific, a document, a record, something that directly ties Bianca to the criminal element and not just the corporate one." She held Elena's eyes. "The DeLuca account, the handwritten document. Is there anything in it that names Bianca specifically?" "Not her father. Her." Elena thought about the 12 pages Thomas had gone through at midnight. She had not read them herself. She'd received Thomas's summary, his voice careful and level even as the content was anything but. "Thomas." She raised her voice slightly. He came to the office door. "The DeLuca account, page 11. You read it to me over the phone." She looked at him. "The reference to the continuation of the arrangement, the payments that were continued after 1997. Thomas was very still. "Yes." "Who signed them?" A pause.
The document references a continuation authorized by E. Russo Jr., Thomas said. The translator noted that Jr. distinguished it from Emilio Sr. It was the only place in the document. That's enough, Sandra said into the phone. She was already talking. Document reference, yes, I'll transmit in 2 minutes. We need the hold request active in the next 10. Elena sat in the wheelchair in the doorway of Gerald Foss's office on the 34th floor of a building she had helped lease 13 years ago, and she listened to Sandra work, and she felt her son move against her ribs, steady and insistent, and outside the windows of the corridor the November sky was going from gray to the particular pale white of late morning, and somewhere at JFK International, in the departures terminal, Bianca Russo was moving toward a gate with her boarding pass in her hand and her father's secrets in her chest, and 30 years of advantage she had never once questioned running out beneath her feet. The hold request hit the system with 6 minutes to spare. Bianca Russo did not make her flight. She was 20 feet from the gate when the airline agent at the desk picked up the phone, listened, and then set it down and walked toward her with the particular expression of someone who has been asked to do something uncomfortable and has decided the most professional way to do it is quickly. 2 men in plain clothes were already moving from the corridor behind her. Not uniformed, not dramatic, just 2 men in dark coats walking with the specific purposeful quiet that Bianca recognized immediately for what it was. She stopped walking. She stood in the departures terminal with her carry-on beside her and her boarding pass in her hand, and the gate 30 seconds behind her, and she looked at the 2 men, and the 2 men looked at her, and the airline agent stopped a respectful distance away and said very quietly that there was a matter requiring her attention before she could board. Bianca said nothing. She put the boarding pass in her coat pocket. She went with them. Thomas got the confirmation at 11:43 and called Elena, who was in the back of a medical transport vehicle on her way back to the hospital, Carlos monitoring her vitals, with the steady attention of someone who had been watching numbers edge upward for the last 90 minutes and was prepared to escalate if they moved another point in the wrong direction. She read the text. She read it twice. Then she set the phone face down on her knee and she looked out the window of the transport at Manhattan going past. The ordinary, extraordinary machinery of it, people on sidewalks, cabs in traffic, a woman walking a dog, a man eating something from a paper bag, all of it indifferent and continuous and entirely unaware of what had just happened on the 34th floor of a midtown building and in the departures terminal at JFK. Carlos said, "Mrs. Belandi, take a breath." She took a breath. She took another one. Under her hand, through the fabric of her coat, her son moved, a slow roll, the kind he made when he was settling rather than protesting. The particular motion she'd come to read as him finding a position he liked. She pressed her palm flat and felt him and thought, "There you are. There you are." "We're going back to the room," Carlos said. "Then you're going to sleep." "I know," she said. "Do you? Because your definition of rest and the medical definition have been in significant disagreement for 4 days." She almost smiled. "I know. She slept for 6 hours. Unbroken sleep, the kind that comes after the body has spent everything it has and simply stops negotiating. She woke at 6 in the evening to the sound of a cart in the hallway and the monitor's steady rhythm and the specific quality of hospital room light that means the day has turned without you." Thomas was in the chair. He was asleep too, his chin dropped toward his chest, his coat folded on his lap, his hands loose. She looked at him for a moment, this man who had driven her to airports and hospitals and boardrooms for 11 years, who had found a photograph under a windshield wiper and understood immediately what it meant and what it would cost, who had spent 3 days barely sleeping so she could spend 6 hours doing it. And she thought about what it meant to be protected by someone who never made it a performance. She thought about Harold Reeves with his red pen and his careful notes. She thought about Diane Reeves standing in a kitchen in Westchester saying, "You were chosen." She let Thomas sleep. She reached for her phone. 3 missed calls from Sandra. 1 from a number she didn't recognize, Palermo area code. 1 from Marco. She called Sandra first. "The federal hold has converted to a formal interview request," Sandra said. She sounded like someone who had also slept, briefly, and was running on the thin fuel of resumed momentum. "Bianca's lawyers are engaged. She hasn't spoken yet. She won't, not today. But the preservation order is in place, and they've begun a review of the Russo Capital records." A pause. The DeLuca document has been transmitted to the appropriate federal office. It's now in a chain of evidence that Bianca's lawyers cannot touch. Another pause. Elena, this is going to take time.
Months, probably. Criminal proceedings at this level with cross-jurisdictional elements. I know, Elena said. She's not going to prison tomorrow. I know that too. But she's not on a plane, Sandra said, and the records are secured, and the board has suspended every agreement with Russo Capital pending the review. A breath. It's not everything, but it's not nothing. It's enough for today, Elena said. What about Marco? A pause. He met with Gerald Foss this afternoon, voluntarily. He brought his own lawyer, not Bianca's firm, a different one. Sandra's voice was careful. He's accepted the interim suspension. He's also, and his lawyer transmitted this formally, acknowledged the founding documentation and agreed not to contest your shareholder standing. Elena was quiet. He didn't fight it, she said. No. She turned this over. She did not know what it meant yet, whether it was strategy or something more, whether the man who had crouched at her eye level in the boardroom and said, I know what I did was a version of Marco that would last, or a version that the pressure had briefly produced and that would fade when the pressure did. She did not know. She was not going to decide today. Okay, she said. What do I need to do tomorrow? Nothing, Sandra said, with the particular firmness of someone who has been managing other people's crises long enough to know when they need to be told to stop. Tomorrow, you lie in that bed and let Dr. Farrow do her job, and you let your son cook for another few weeks. Everything else is in motion. I have it. Sandra. I have it, Elena. She let out a long breath. Okay. She hung up. She looked at the Palermo number. She dialed it. Salvatore answered on the second ring, as if he'd been holding the phone. I heard, he said, without preamble, without formality. Thomas called me. Are you still in New York? Yes, I extended the hotel. A pause. I wasn't going to leave while things were... He stopped. I wasn't going to leave. She thought about what that cost a man who had spent 30 years being unable to protect his daughter. The simple act of staying in the same city. I want to see you again, she said. When I'm out of here. When Noah is stable and I'm on my feet. I want... She stopped. Found the words carefully, the way she'd always approached things that mattered. I want to try. I don't know what that looks like yet. I don't know what I can give you or what you need from me or how any of this works. But I want to try. The silence on his end lasted long enough that she thought the connection had dropped. Then she heard him breathe. Just that. One breath. A man processing something his body understood before his words did. That's everything, he said, very quietly. That's all I needed to hear. Noah Belandi was born at 35 weeks, and one day, on a Tuesday morning in December, during a snowfall that started at 4 a.m. and was still going when Elena was transferred to the delivery room at 7. The labor was 14 hours. It was not easy. Dr. Farrow was there for all of it, and 2 other members of her team, and Thomas sat in the waiting room for 14 hours without eating anything and without checking his phone except twice, once to call Sandra and once to call Salvatore, who was at the hotel, and who arrived at the hospital at hour 9 and sat beside Thomas in the waiting room in total silence, the 2 of them side by side in plastic chairs with their hands on their knees, which was perhaps the strangest pairing the waiting room had ever contained and which neither of them remarked upon. Marco was in the hallway, not in the waiting room, in the hallway outside it, standing with his back against the wall, present without inserting himself, which was the right call, and which Elena would acknowledge to herself later, privately, without telling him she'd noticed. At 9:17 p.m., Noah entered the world at 5 pounds and 2 ounces, furious and loud and entirely himself. They put him in a warming unit immediately. His lungs were good. Dr. Farrow said it with the particular satisfaction of someone reporting a result they'd worked hard to produce. His heart was good. He was small, and he would need time, and the NICU team was ready and competent, and everything that was supposed to be in place was in place. They let Elena see him before they took him. They held him close to her face. She couldn't hold him, not yet, the lines and the warming protocols. And she looked at him. This small, furious person who had spent 35 weeks refusing to leave, who had held on through all of it, the ballroom and the hospital and the boardroom and the federal preservation order and 14 hours of labor, who had simply declined, stubbornly and consistently, to stop. She looked at his face. She said very quietly, so that only he could hear, "I see you. I've got you. We're okay." He stopped crying for exactly 4 seconds. Then he started again, which Dr. Farrow said was exactly what she wanted him to do. Marco came into the recovery room at 11 p.m. Elena had been expecting him. She told the nurse it was all right. He came in and stood at the foot of the bed and looked at her. Not at the room, not at the door, at her. For a moment before he said anything. She saw the thing on his face that she'd been watching for and hadn't been sure she'd find. The unguarded version of him, the one that existed before the money and after the performance. The version she'd married thinking it was the whole of him. It wasn't the whole of him. She understood that clearly now, with the clean clarity that comes after you've stopped hoping for something to be different. He was not the man she'd thought she married, and the man she'd thought she married had never been entirely real, and that grief was real and she was going to carry it, but it was not going to be the largest thing she carried. "He looks like you," Marco said. "They let me see him through the window." "His eyes," she said. "When they were open for a minute, your father's eyes." Something moved across Marco's face, complicated and human and not entirely controlled. He pressed his lips together. "Antonio would have—" he started. "I know," she said. "He would have been good at it, being a grandfather." Marco nodded. He looked at his hands, which he was holding together in front of him, not laced, just held, uncertain, which was not a quality she'd seen him wear often, and which sat on him with the awkward honesty of something new. "I have to ask you something," he said. "Okay." "The watch." He looked up. "I know you had it. I know you restored it. Thomas told me, not the details, just that you'd—" He stopped. "Do you still have it?" She looked at him for a moment. She reached into the drawer of the bedside table. She put it on the blanket between them. Marco looked at it. He didn't reach for it. "I'm not asking you to—" he started. "I don't deserve—" "Marco." She picked it up and held it out. "It was your father's. It belongs with you." She held his gaze. Not as forgiveness. Not as anything except what it is. He was a good man, and this was his. And Noah should know it existed. Marco took it. His hand was not steady. He held it for a moment, the silver warm from the drawer, the restored crystal catching the room's light. He looked at the engraving on the back. For the man who built something real, and his jaw tightened with the particular tension of someone fighting something that doesn't want to be fought. He set it on the bedside table. He straightened. "I'm going to do the work," he said. "The therapy. The legal accounting. Everything the board requires. I'm going to do all of it." He held her gaze. "Not for forgiveness. I understand that's not— I understand. But for Noah." He paused. "And because it's the right thing, which I know doesn't mean anything right now, but I'm going to do it anyway." Elena looked at him. She thought about the man who had said cheap toy into a microphone in front of 400 people. She thought about the man crouching at eye level in the boardroom. She thought about the man standing in a hospital hallway for 14 hours without being asked to be there. People were not single things. She had learned that. It was one of the more inconvenient things she'd learned, because it would have been so much easier if they were. "I know you will," she said. "I'll be watching." He almost smiled. It was a sad smile, the kind that knows what it costs to earn. "I know you will." He left. The divorce was finalized on a Thursday in February, in a proceeding that lasted 40 minutes and was, by the standards of high-asset dissolutions involving founding shareholder disputes and concurrent federal preservation proceedings, remarkably civil. Sandra had negotiated the terms over 6 weeks, with the precision and patience of someone building something that needed to hold underweight. Elena's founding shareholder stake was formally recognized. A structured buyout agreement was established. Noah's custody arrangement was detailed with the specific care of 2 people who had stopped fighting each other and started thinking about a third person. Marco sat across the table and signed where his lawyer indicated and did not make it difficult. When it was done, he looked across the table at Elena and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, I'm sorry, for the record. Not strategically, just, I'm sorry. Elena looked at him. I know, she said. She picked up her copy of the agreement, put it in her bag, and left. Bianca Russo was indicted on 4 counts in March. The charges included fraud, conspiracy, obstruction, and a federal count related to the concealment of evidence in a decades-old kidnapping investigation. The last count being the one that had required the most work, the most cross-jurisdictional cooperation, the most careful assembly of the De Luca document and the Russo capital records, and the testimony of Aldo Gallo, who had agreed to cooperate in exchange for considerations his lawyer had negotiated, and who sat in a federal building in Lower Manhattan and answered questions for 3 days with the precise exhaustion of a man who has been afraid for a long time and has finally decided that the fear costs more than the telling. Emilio Russo was indicted alongside his daughter. He was 81 years old and his health was poor, and his lawyer argued strenuously that the proceedings would constitute undue hardship. The argument was heard and noted, and the proceedings were continued regardless. Elena followed the news the way she followed most things now, with attention but without consuming it, keeping it in its proper proportion relative to the things that were actually happening in her daily life, which were considerable. She had a 4-month-old who had graduated from the NICU after 3 weeks, and who was, according to every metric available, catching up with the particular determined efficiency of someone making up for lost time. She had a company, or her portion of it, which she was learning to exercise with the help of board members who were, it turned out, much more willing to listen to a founding shareholder than they had been to listen to a co-founder's wife. She had Sandra, who had transitioned from crisis manager to trusted counsel with the natural ease of a relationship that had been forged under pressure and found to be solid. She had Thomas, who drove her to meetings and waited and said the right amount, which was usually not very much. She had Salvatore. That was the one she was still learning. He did not insert himself. That was the first thing she had told him in the conversation at the hotel 2 weeks after Noah was born, when she had sat across from him in a restaurant near the hospital, and they had eaten a meal together for the first time, and it had been deeply, thoroughly awkward in the way of 2 people with enormous things in common and no shared history, and she had said, I need you to let me set the pace. He had said, I understand. And he had meant it. She'd been watching for whether he meant it, the way she watched everything now. Not paranoid, just calibrated, the careful attention of someone who has learned what happens when you stop paying attention. And he meant it. He called when she initiated contact. He came when invited. He sat with Noah in the way of a man who understands that trust is built in increments, and that the child in front of him is both the most important thing in the room and something that will take years to feel entitled to. He told her about her mother. Not all at once. Over time, in the way you give someone something precious, carefully, in pieces, so they can hold each piece before they receive the next. Her mother's name had been Lucia. She had been a painter, small canvases, not professionally, just because she needed to. She had made a specific pasta that Salvatore could not replicate no matter how many times he tried. She had died 11 years after Alessia disappeared, and Salvatore believed, he said it simply, without drama, that the not knowing had taken years from her that the grief alone would not have. Elena listened. She added each piece to the picture she was building, slowly, of a life she had not lived and people she had not known, and a self she was still integrating into the one she'd always had. It was not a clean process. It was not linear. There were days she felt grateful for every revelation, and days she felt the profound disorientation of someone standing in 2 places at once. The life she'd built with the Reeves family, the people who had found her and loved her and raised her, and the life that had been interrupted before she could remember it. She went to Westchester and sat in Diane Reeves's kitchen and told her mother the whole of it, the DNA results, and Salvatore, and the kidnapping, and all of it. And Diane had listened with the particular stillness of someone processing something very large. And when Elena finished, Diane had said, I always knew someone loved you before I did. I always told you that. And Elena had cried. For the first time in all of it, she had cried. Not in the hospital, not in the boardroom, not when Thomas had shown her the photograph, or Sandra had read her the psychiatric filing, or the contractions had started in the back of a car on a wet Manhattan night. In her mother's kitchen in Westchester, at the same table where Harold Reeves had sat with a red pen and a coffee and a patient attention that had shaped the way Elena thought about everything. She cried for a while, Diane sat with her and did not try to stop her and did not say anything, just put her hand on Elena's arm, the same gesture Carla had used at the gala, the same gesture Dr. Farrow had used, the quiet language of women who understand that presence is the thing and words are secondary. Then Diane made tea, and they sat, and eventually they talked about Noah, because there was always more to say about Noah. The Alessia Grace Foundation was incorporated in April. The name had taken Elena 2 weeks to settle on. She had not wanted it to be about her, had resisted the suggestion when Sandra first floated it, had argued for something more general, less personal. Sandra had said, "It is personal. It should be personal." The foundation is built on what happened to a specific child, and naming it erases that child, and that child deserves not to be erased. Elena had sat with that for a while. Then she had agreed. The foundation's initial focus was 4 areas: missing children and family reunification support, adoptive family resources, premature infant care advocacy, and legal aid for women navigating institutional systems without resources. The specific kind of institutional machinery that had been used against Elena herself, and that she understood from the inside in ways that purely theoretical advocates did not. Salvatore contributed the founding capital. He had insisted, and she had let him, understanding that it was something he needed to do. The restoration, in whatever form available, of the thing that had been taken from him the most permanently, which was not money and not time, but the ability to provide for his daughter. The board of the foundation included Sandra Park, Richard Chu, a NICU nurse named Maria who had cared for Noah during his 3 weeks and who had a talent for administration that she'd been underusing for years, and Thomas Greco, who had accepted the invitation with a single nod and a quiet, "If you think I'm useful." Elena had said, "I couldn't have done any of this without you." Thomas had looked at the floor for a moment. Then he had said, "You did it. I drove." Noah's first birthday was in December. They held it in the garden behind the foundation's Brooklyn Center, which had been a former community art space that they'd renovated over the summer. A low, wide building with large windows and a garden that someone had planted seriously years ago and that had been somewhat neglected, and that the foundation's facilities coordinator, a man named James who treated every garden as a personal project, had restored over the fall with the kind of focused energy that produces results. It was cold. Brooklyn December, the particular thin cold that comes off the harbor, and everyone was in coats and there were heat lamps at the corners of the garden, and someone had strung lights in the bare branches of the trees along the back wall, which had been Noah's idea in the sense that Elena had pointed at the lights in a shop window 6 weeks earlier, and he had made the sound he made that meant he wanted it. He made a lot of sounds now. Not words yet, but the architecture of words, the rhythm and intention of communication, the specific sounds he made for specific things, the ones she'd learned to read the way you learn a new language, which is to say imperfectly at first, and then suddenly, one day, fluently. He was sitting on a blanket in the garden with his legs in front of him and his hands pressed flat to the ground, which was his current position of choice, a kind of grounded preparatory stance, for a person who has recently figured out that standing is possible and is still deciding how to feel about it. Salvatore was sitting on the ground beside him. This was the image Elena kept coming back to, in the years that followed, when she tried to explain to people what the day had felt like. The white-haired 67-year-old man in his good coat sitting on the ground in a Brooklyn garden in December because his grandson was on the ground, and he wanted to be at the same level. Salvatore had lowered himself to the ground with the careful effort of someone his age doing something his body was not entirely happy about, and he had settled beside Noah, and Noah had looked at him with the specific round-eyed assessment of a person encountering a familiar face in an unfamiliar position, and then had reached out and grabbed Salvatore's finger with a completeness of grip that made Salvatore close his eyes for a moment. Just for a moment. Then he opened them and looked at the child. Thomas stood near the heat lamp with a cup of something warm and watched all of it with the expression Elena recognized as his "watching is enough" face. She had learned to be grateful for people who were good at presence without performance. There were not enough of them. Diane Reeves was there, in a coat she'd had for 15 years and good boots, talking to Maria from the NICU with the ease of 2 women who have found in each other an immediate and mutual recognition. Sandra was near the building entrance with a glass of wine and her phone, which she kept looking at and then putting away, the reflexive behavior of someone training themselves out of a habit. Marco came at 2. He had been invited. Elena had sent the invitation herself, through his lawyer's office, which was how they communicated now, carefully and functionally. And he had confirmed, and he had arrived on time, which was a quality he was apparently redeveloping, the way you redevelop a muscle after disuse. He came through the garden gate and looked around and found Noah on his blanket and went directly there, which was the right order of priorities. And Elena watched him crouch down and say something to his son, and watched Noah look at him with that same round-eyed assessment, and then grab for the collar of his coat. Marco laughed. It was his real laugh. She could still tell the difference. She probably always would. And the sound of it was both familiar and strange. The way things you've known for a long time can become strange when the context changes. And she stood near the edge of the garden and held her cup of tea and thought about everything the sound carried and did not try to resolve it. Some things didn't resolve. She was learning to hold that without it meaning failure. She walked toward Noah. She sat on the blanket beside him, across from Salvatore, and Marco shifted to make room and didn't make it complicated, and the four of them, this particular accidental arrangement of people connected by blood and law and history and loss, and the stubbornness of a small boy who had refused to stop, sat in the December cold in the garden with the lights and the bare branches overhead. Noah looked at each of them in turn. He had his great-grandfather Salvatore's jaw and his father's eyes, and he had something in his face that Elena recognized as belonging to no one but himself, the specific selfhood that arrives complete and insists on being seen for what it is. He looked at Elena last. He looked at her for a long moment, with the particular steady attention he brought to everything, this child who had come into the world fighting and had not stopped. And then he pressed both hands flat to the blanket and pushed. He pushed himself to his feet. He stood. Unsteady. His legs were doing the work that legs do when they are new at bearing weight, the small constant adjustments, the distributed effort of staying upright. He stood with his hands out to the sides, not reaching for anything, just balancing, his face carrying the serious concentration of someone doing something that requires everything they have. He took one step. It landed. He took another. It landed. He looked at Elena. She looked back at him. She did not reach for him yet because he wasn't falling, and he didn't need her to catch him, and she had learned. In the hospital, in the boardroom, in the restaurant with Salvatore, in her mother's kitchen in Westchester. The difference between support and interference, the crucial difference between being there and taking over. He took a third step. And then, because he was Noah and he had always known his own mind, he turned away from all of them and walked toward the open doors of the building, toward the light coming out of the windows, toward whatever was inside that had caught his attention. He did not look back. Elena watched him go. She felt Salvatore look at her, and she felt Marco look at her, and she felt Thomas, from across the garden, look at her, and she sat in the middle of all that quiet attention and watched her son walk toward an open door, and she thought about the white leather shoes in the cardboard box, and about Harold with his red pen, and about Diane's hand on her arm, and about 35 weeks and 4 days and a ring in a champagne glass, and a photograph under a windshield wiper, and a man who had carried a folded piece of paper in his coat for 11 years because he knew what it was worth. She thought about all the ways a person's life can be taken apart and put back together differently. She thought, this is what it looks like. The putting back together. It looks like this, imperfect and cold and lit by borrowed lights, and populated by people with complicated histories and one small boy who has somewhere to be. She stood up. She followed him inside.